into the provisions of the Treasury Laws Amendment Electric Car Discount Bill 2022. I begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here today. The committee will be conducting today's hearing in person and via video conference. The Deputy Chair, Senator Andrew Bragg, Senator Janet Rice and I will be participating remotely via video conference. If you agree to provide an answer to a question on notice during the hearing, please note that the committee has agreed responses to questions on notice should be provided to the Secretariat by COB next Wednesday, 31st of August. These are public proceedings being streamed live via the Parliament's website, and a Hansard transcript is being made. Witnesses should speak clearly into the microphones to assist Hansard to record proceedings. I remind all witnesses that in giving evidence to the committee, they are protected by parliamentary privilege. It is unlawful for anyone to threaten or disadvantage a witness on account of evidence given to a committee, and such action may be treated by the Senate as a contempt. It is also a contempt to give false or misleading evidence. Witnesses also have a right to request to be heard in camera. If a witness objects to answering a question, they should state the grounds upon which the objection is made, and the committee will determine whether it will insist on an answer having regard to the ground which is claimed. If the committee determines to insist on an answer, a witness may request that the answer be given in camera. I ask everyone to ensure that they have turned their mobile phones to silent, and I now welcome representatives from the Australia Institute. I understand that information on parliamentary privilege and the protection of witnesses giving evidence to Senate committees has been provided to you. For the Hansard record, will you please state your full names and the capacity in which you appear today?
Thank you, Chair. Richie Merzian, Climate and Energy Program Director at the Australia Institute.
Sumitri Venkatasubrahmanyan, Fellow at the Australia Institute.
Can you just say your surname?
Welcome.
So we can get it
I
right.
now invite you.
Venkatasubrahmanyan.
Venkatasubrahmanyan. Okay, thank you.
Welcome. I now invite you to make a short opening statement, and at the conclusion of any remarks, I'll invite members of the committee to ask questions.
Thank you, Senator. Thank you for the opportunity to give evidence to the Economics Legislation Committee on the Treasury Laws Amendment Electric Car Discount Bill 2022. The bill provides modest and beneficial changes to the tax treatment of electric vehicles. It is a welcome first step following a decade of inaction on zero emissions transport. The proposed amendments to exempt electric vehicles from the fringe benefits tax will provide an incentive for employers to assist employees to purchase electric vehicles and help create a much-needed market for second-hand electric vehicles. The bill is applicable to battery electric, hydrogen fuel cell and plug-in hybrid electric vehicles, collectively termed zero or low emissions vehicles. The Australia Institute recommends narrowing the wording to include only zero emissions vehicles. This would bring federal transport legislation in line with leading policy in the ACT, Europe and other markets. Changes brought about by the bill form a piece of the puzzle to make the transition away from internal combustion vehicles across Australia. Additional policies to encourage both supply and demand of electric vehicles will complement this move and accelerate the decarbonisation of Australia's transport. Last Friday, at the National EV Summit co-hosted by the Australia Institute, the Electric Vehicle Council, the Smart Energy Council and Boundless, the philanthropic fund of Mike Cannon-Brookes, the Minister for Climate Change and Energy announced the National Electric Vehicle Strategy. As part of the strategy, the Minister announced that the federal government will be investigating the inclusion of mandatory fuel efficiency standards, standards with ambition that are, quote, as close to best practice as is achievable. The implementation of such standards would finally put Australia in line with almost all other countries in the OECD. The National EV Strategy offers the opportunity for a coordinated approach to achieve zero emissions transport in Australia, working with state and territory governments to encourage individuals to buy electric vehicles. The benefits of being behind the pack means that we can learn from others' successes, for example, on registration rebates and priority lane access for zero emissions vehicles. There are also more policy opportunities, like trade-in rebates and exempting electric vehicles from the luxury car tax. The Australia Institute's polling shows that Australians strongly support policy incentives that make electric vehicles more affordable and accessible. There is a clear appetite for Australia to take more decisive steps to make the transition to zero-emission transport, which will in turn reduce our reliance on imported oil. Alongside the national EV strategy, we need a complementary liquid fuel security strategy, given that 91% of our fuels are derived from imports. We need to have demand-side solutions to lower demand for foreign oil. These additional policies would complement the changes that will be brought about by the Electric Car Discount Bill to bring about a much-needed push towards transport decarbonisation, which my colleague Richie Merzian will speak more about. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Go ahead, Mr. Merzian.
That concludes our opening statement. Senator, it might be more practical for us to open up to questions.
Okay, great. Thank you both. I'll just kick off with a quick general question. In your submission and in your opening statements, you've called the bill a modest contribution to correct a decade of inaction. And you've said you'd like some changes to this bill, and also that you think there's just a lot more that needs to be done over time. Just to start off with, can you just expand on your comments that the FBT exemption will have some impact on employer behaviour in providing EV vehicles and flow into the second-hand market? So, albeit that you'd like to see more changes, can you just tell us how you think this particular change will help stimulate the EV market?
Be happy to, Chair. It's our understanding that about 50% of new car sales are fleet purchases in Australia, and therefore finding ways to incentivise fleet purchase of zero-emission vehicles is a key part of how we decarbonise transport. Transport is a bit under 1/5 of our national emissions, but more concerningly, of all the different sectors in the economy, transport has grown the most since we originally signed up to the UN Convention on Climate Change. So any policy that can bring down transport emissions is a welcome one, and this is certainly part of that picture. Targeting fleet purchases, incentivising businesses to allow employees to purchase electric vehicles, and then obviously excluding from the FBT, I think will be a key part in driving that, because we know that first-hand purchases often do come from fleets, and we know that oftentimes they'll rotate relatively quicker than if it was solely for private use. Then we will see more vehicles ultimately flow into the second-hand market. Currently, there are few cars in the second-hand market in the electric vehicle space. The shortage in Australia is not just in the first-hand market, but also in the second-hand market. I know just from personal experience that there's now far more interest in importing second-hand electric vehicles in Australia because there is a real shortage in terms of those more affordable rates, and second-hand cars will provide more affordability in the electric vehicle space as well. So it is a useful, welcome change. Our comment around the modesty of this approach is that it is one of many policies that the government can bring forward and the Parliament can approve, and would be happy to talk to some of the others as well, including our suggestion for amending the legislation as well.
Okay. Just one more question from me before I share the call with colleagues. Because you do have some ideas about amendments to the bill, and because you've got quite a wide suite of additional sort of measures that you'd like to see in place, what are your views about the 3-year review that is part of the legislation? Do you think that's an opportunity to have a look at how we've gone and potentially expand further?
In response to your question, Chair, yes, it would be a good opportunity to check in to see how the changes have come about. I know that some other submissions shared concerns around whether that will send the right signals in terms of the confidence for people to invest in these cars. Currently, there's a shortage in the supply of electric vehicles, first-hand electric vehicles, and this is also backdated. And so I think there are reasonable points to be made about whether that should be extended out, not just 3 years, maybe a bit later, and then also just clarifying the fact that that the review won't take place any earlier, that anything will be, in a sense, honoured that has been purchased within that period. So I think further clarity around that and potentially extending it might be worth doing given the current state of the market.
Okay, thank you both very much. I'm sure there's lots of questions for you, so I'll go first to Senator Rice.
Thanks, Chair, and thank you both for your submission and for your contributions this morning. You talked about this bill being a modest contribution and that you would like to see it narrowed and that you've got some amendments. Could you talk us through what your proposed amendments would be?
Certainly. My colleague referred to the definition that is being used in the amendment, and our recommendation is that it's narrowed further. Ultimately, in simplistic terms, it would exclude plug-in hybrids from benefiting from this exemption. The reason we would recommend that is because ultimately plug-in hybrids still have internal combustion engine vehicles. They are a transition vehicle in our attempt to ultimately decarbonise the transport sector. Australia is behind the pack when it comes to cleaning up its transport. So we, in a sense, have the benefit to learn from what's working overseas. And the clear indication is that, firstly, hybrids are only used a minority of the time as electric vehicles. The study commissioned by the International Council on Clean Transportation looked at the real-world use of over 100,000 hybrids in Europe, North America, and in China, and found that when used privately, so just when it was privately owned, hybrids were only used in the electric mode 1/3 of the time. When they were company cars, they were only used in the electric mode 1/5 of the time. So if ultimately we're driving, excuse the pun, if ultimately we're looking to clean up our transport sector by getting more zero-emission vehicles to be used, and where there are electric options, getting those electric options used more often, then we're not sure hybrid is the best course of action. On top of that, we're seeing that best practice is excluding hybrids from targets around moving away from internal combustion engine vehicles, both excluding it from the range of subsidies available. I know that Germany, for example, is scrapping its plug-in hybrid subsidies this year. We also know that if you look at world leaders like Norway, their target of 100% zero-emission vehicles by 2025 in 3 years' time does not include hybrids. There's a long list of countries we'd be happy to go through that have basically ruled out hybrids as part of their target for new car sales. We think we should be learning from this and incentivising the best. We deserve the best. We're playing catch-up, so we should be demanding the best and incentivising the best. And that means basically going straight for zero-emission vehicles and therefore narrowing the definition.
Thank you. And so given that, would you actually feel that subsidising hybrids isn't a good use of public money?
Yes, I agree, Senator, that there would be better uses of public money if our ultimate goal is to decarbonise the transport sector.
And in fact, would you actually consider it a fossil fuel subsidy, given as you're saying, the evidence is that hybrids, plug-in electric hybrids, actually use a lot of fossil fuels?
Yeah, what one could conclude, Senator, that there would be a perverse incentive here, that if the car is used as the real-world experience shows from the study that I mentioned, then the majority of time that it would be used as an internal combustion engine vehicle.
Thank you. And look, my final question is that on the home charging infrastructure that we've received submissions noting that it's not included under the FBT exemptions, would you support home charging infrastructure being included as part of the operating costs of owning an electric vehicle?
Senator, we don't have a strong view on that in particular, but if it is incentivising infrastructure that will be used to assist in the electrification of transport and providing that utility at home, we know the majority of charging usually does take place at home, but if these are going to be company cars, then providing these services as well at workplaces and other locations would be good. I mean, again, we're behind the ball in terms of the infrastructure we require for electric transport as much as the vehicles. And so incentives to bring more of that to Australia would help. The other thing to note is that the Australian Institute regularly polls views on climate change, including on transport, in our Climate of the Nation report. And last year we found that actually one of the highest rating in policies that Australians support. 3/4 of Australians want governments to increase domestic manufacturing of zero-emission vehicles, batteries and components, including the charging infrastructure as well. Having incentives in place to demand more of these things would only provide us with a local market and hopefully local opportunities as well.
Great, thanks very much. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Senator Rice. Senator Pocock.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks for your time this morning. Your submission raises the need for exemption of EVs from luxury car tax. Does that not raise equity issues? And on the same note, what about increasing luxury car taxes on non-EVs?
Senator, you raise a good point. Currently, Australia lacks affordable electric vehicles in the new car sale market. I think there's over 25 in the UK that are under 60 grand Australian, and there's less than 10 in Australia. And so really we're looking at what policies you can put in place to bring as many electric vehicles as possible with a good focus on the affordability end of the spectrum, but then also noting that currently electric vehicles are expensive, and we're not going to reach cost parity for another few years, and there are a fair few in the higher end. But those cars will ultimately flow down the system and become second-hand vehicles. Now, I remember my old Holden Calais, which would have been outside my range if I bought first-hand, but given it was 15 years old, was within range when I bought it second-hand. There are benefits flowing on. So we think that there's a suite of policies we can bring forward, including just finding ways to bring all types of electric vehicles to Australia.
Mm-hmm. One of the other things that you raised was a potential trade-in rebate for increasing the supply of EVs. How would that work, and what happens to those vehicles that are traded in?
It's a good question. There are numerous examples overseas of how this scheme works. We'd be happy to share details of some of them. They range quite broadly, but in simple terms, you'd receive a certain amount of funding if you did trade in your old internal combustion engine vehicles, which could then be applied towards the purchase of a cleaner vehicle. Mm-hmm. That car would then be scrapped and parts be used and hopefully help with the other end of the cycle, which is sort of the recycling and circular economy of what we do with these old vehicles as well. Mm-hmm. But there are great examples of how this works. That's one. Another one is the fee-bait scheme that New Zealand has brought in place. At the Electric Vehicle Summit that my colleague mentioned on Friday, the New Zealand Minister for Transport mentioned that they had gone from 3% new car sales electric to 20% in a bit over a year, mainly through targeted policies, one of which was the fee-bait scheme. So putting an additional levy on high-polluting vehicles and then using that to incentivize low-polluting vehicles and electric vehicles. Mm-hmm. And so in a sense, it was a cost-neutral program to tax the things you don't want and incentivize the things you do.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And just finally, do you have a view on whether the FBT exemption should be extended to e-bikes, more sort of active transport?
Senator, that's a great recommendation. We would fully support that. We think there should be a variety of mobility options available. We know the popularity just in our town here in the ACT of electric scooters. We would also see great opportunities incentivising electric bikes, and I believe the ACT government locally have just included electric bikes in the next round of their EV strategy and incentives as well. That would be a welcome addition.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Senator Pocock. I'll go now to Senator Smith.
Thank you very much, and welcome to the Australia Institute. What are some of the impediments in the Australian EV market that might dampen the take-up of this particular FBT initiative?
Thank you, Senator, for your question. I mean, right now there is a shortage of supply. The Electric Vehicle Council, I think, recently shared anecdotal evidence of manufacturers bringing over a shipment of 500 new EVs and selling out within a day, having a back catalogue in the months. So really we can't get the electric vehicles we want, in a sense, because Australia's competing on the global market. We're a car taker as a country now rather than a car maker, so we have to compete on the global market for vehicles. And the lack of a mandatory fuel efficiency standard, which puts us in the minority of countries. 80% of the world have mandatory fuel efficiency standards on light vehicles. We don't here. Basically means that manufacturers are incentivized to send their cleanest cars, particularly electric vehicles, to other markets, whereas they have no incentive to do that here. If anything, they're penalised if they don't send sufficient electric vehicles to other countries. And so it really means that we're at the bottom of the pecking order. And if we want to drive that up, if we want to change those decisions, then we need to bring in mandatory fuel efficiency standards, which is why it was a welcome announcement from Minister Bowen on Friday that the electric vehicle strategy will include a policy on mandatory fuel efficiency standards. Our recommendation would be that that should be a robust fuel efficiency standard in line with Europe, which is best practice, because ultimately if it's weaker than that, we're still going to be lower on the pecking order. And there's no impediment to us bringing over these cleaner vehicles here. But really it's just a matter of sending the right signals and competing on that market to get the vehicles we need. And hopefully we can do that.
A technical clarification, are you talking about Euro 6 there level instead of Euro 5?
No, Senator, I'm talking more around, so they're otherwise known as CO2 emission standards, fuel efficiency standards, so they're more around the grams per, the grams of CO2 per kilometre. I think the Euro values are more around the tailpipe emissions and qualifying the standards there.
If you could provide me with something that will help me understand that and the difference, I'd very much appreciate it. Thank you, Senator Smith.
So that's two factors that might dampen this initiative. Are there any others? People often cite the lack of charging infrastructure. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, that is a fair assessment. Australia is still, certainly nowhere near where other OECD countries are in terms of charging infrastructure, public charging infrastructure. But I would caveat that the majority of charging usually takes place at home, and Australia is quite fortunate in that we have a high uptake of home ownership in the sense that the majority of Australians would have the opportunity to charge at home, but that obviously doesn't count for some apartment buildings and those who live in places where it doesn't exist. So there are some impediments there in terms of charging infrastructure. I do believe that the federal government does have a policy of bringing forward more charging infrastructure to the point where we will have this publicly available every 150 kilometres on major arteries. And also, I think there's efforts being made at the state level to try and correct this as well.
And when do you think that ambition will be realised? The charging stations within 150 kilometres of each other?
I'm not sure exactly. I think the details are yet forthcoming.
So just going to your first point where you identified the shortage of supply of EV vehicles, isn't the perverse effect that this initiative could actually force the price up at a time when we're trying to make them affordable because there is a shortage of supply?
I think there are many factors involved in sort of price setting for these vehicles. I mean, already the demand is exceptionally high, and that's mainly being driven by the really high oil price. Unfortunately, Australia basically imports the majority of its petrol and its diesel. 91% of our liquid fuels are imported. That's gotten worse over the last 10 years, not better. We only have 2 refineries in Australia. We have very few resources locally for oil extraction. We don't have any fuel tankers, commercial fuel tankers with Australian flags on it. So Australia is incredibly vulnerable in terms of liquid fuel security, and we're completely vulnerable to the price as well, unfortunately. I think that's been a major driver here and also overseas, is what we understand as well in terms of the high demand. I think that this might increase interest, but ultimately the demand and the price is being driven by numerous factors.
So the creation of a second-hand market is something that many people have identified as a positive byproduct or a key ingredient. On a scale of 1 to 10, this initiative, how effective is it in developing that second-hand market? With 10 out of 10 being extremely effective.
Would this be sort of absent any other policies that are being considered by the current federal government to complement this?
I think we can only deal with the policies that are known to us, yeah.
certainly.
No, sorry.
Point
I
of
think-
order, Chair. Point of order, Chair.
Senator O'Neill, I'm asking the questions. Yeah.
Point of order, Chair. The committee is. The committee has already been referred to the minister's public statement last Friday. So if Senator Smith wants to pretend it didn't exist, he can ask questions in a vacuum, but that is not effective in terms of interrogating the legislation.
I think we'll deal with those matters that are legislated or known to be legislated. So sorry for Senator O'Neill's interruption. Yep.
No, don't apologise for me, Senator Smith. That's inappropriate.
Thank you, Senator O'Neill.
Thanks, Senator
Yep.
Smith. Thanks, Senator Smith and Senator O'Neill, and I appreciate your assistance with the challenges of remote chairing, and just wanted to suggest if that could be your last question, Senator Smith, we'll finish up
Actually,
with a
I've got
couple of
two
questions
final
from
questions,
Senator O'Neill.
actually, which won't take very long, but I am just interested to know how effective this will be in creating that second-hand market, which many submitters have identified as being, a key next step.
Yeah, it will be a helpful addition to the second-hand market, and it will have a serious. It'll be a serious attempt at improving upon that. So we would see this as certainly a substantive addition to the second-hand market.
Have you been able to quantify exactly how many new electric vehicles will be on the roads as a result of this initiative?
No, Senator, there are too many factors that are outside our knowledge to be able to quantify that.
Could you have a look at the Institute of Public Accountants submission? In their submission, they have quantified what they expect to be the total number of new electric vehicles over the 4-year period, and perhaps you might be able to provide to the committee any comment on the accuracy or otherwise of their estimations. That would be much appreciated.
Certainly, Senator.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Smith. Senator O'Neill.
Thank you very much, Chair. And after 9 years of being in the no-go zone on this, I think it's fantastic that there is excitement about the possibility of the transformation that should have been happening a long time ago. I'll probably ask a couple of questions on notice, but I'd like to refer you to the submission from the Uniting Care Queensland. If you wouldn't mind having a look at what they've said, I know that you, if I've heard you correctly, have rejected the need for the hybrids. I've got two questions about that. Can you respond to Uniting Care, who indicate that not only by adopting early in 2009 has it made financial sense to them, they have actually materialised profit and gain on the sale into a second-hand market. So there's that. They also talk about fuel security issue, which you mentioned, by having hybrid, being able to operate in the two modes. Can I ask you, in your submission to us, how much research did you do in regional and rural Australia? Because it is a very, very different life for that very productive part of our country.
Thank you, Senator. I haven't read the Uniting Care submission, so I'd be happy to look
That's
at
on
that.
notice, yep.
And take that on notice. In terms of the opportunities that electrification will provide for regional Australia, we've done some research and looked at a few of looked at a number of different inputs in terms of how this will ultimately impact regional Australia. We think that there's opportunity here for regional Australia to electrify as much as urban Australia. If anything, the average commute is longer, the transportation costs are higher, and if you look at the opportunities involved, if you did put in the right infrastructure, then actually the savings could be quite great, as well as the opportunities of actually using locally made fuels through the rooftop or through regional renewable projects. There are numerous opportunities that you can stack on top of each other to ultimately make electrification
so I
positive.
can see elements there of the if and the possibility and could, and we want to move into making that real. But there is a vast difference in living 4 hours away from your regional hospital and 4 minutes or 40 minutes in a city area where there might be charging infrastructure. So this bill has been critiqued in some ways as being inappropriately engaging with the hybrid sector. And you've given evidence that you don't think it should go that way either. But where is the recourse for huge amounts of productive Australia who do not have the infrastructure that will enable them to actually have solely EVs?
So, Senator, sorry, could you just clarify the question that you're asking?
So do you really think it's fair at this point of time, given the nature of infrastructure in regional and rural Australia, to submit to this committee that it should only apply this fringe benefit tax to solely electrical vehicles, because we need to speak to every person in our nation and move along the journey together. And we cannot ignore the regional rural people in Australia and the physical realities they confront. So why did you submit without that lens being applied?
Senator, the recommendation we made was not to the exclusion of the impact of what would happen to regional Australia. We made it in the sense that we believe that this will be to the benefit of all Australians, ultimately, firstly, as a climate policy, but secondly, our understanding is really the range that electric vehicles now have, the newest range, is sufficient to cover a number of trips that would be taken both by urban Australians and by regional Australians. I believe there's ANU research that's found that 9 in 10 people living in regional Australia will be within range of the nearest service hub, be able to make a trip without having to stop to charge. This is with the latest round of EVs, and this is what ultimately we want to attract to Australia. By setting the right signals, by having the right demand, by putting in place the right standards, we'll be able to bring over the best vehicles, and those vehicles will be to the benefit of regional Australians as much as urban Australians. We believe that hybrids are really a transition, much like, installing landlines when you could go straight to mobile technology. We believe that hybrids have served a purpose, but ultimately, if we're looking at bringing over the best vehicles, then those would be electric.
I really want to agree with you, but I guess the comments that you made about being at the bottom of the pecking order in terms of the delivery of vehicles to us, and given the incredible supply chain disruption that exists, the reality of getting the quality of vehicles that you've just been talking about is really somewhere down the track. There seems to be another argument for enabling Australians to purchase hybrid and to support those fleets that are going to enable that, because there is some gain, even if we shouldn't let the perfect be the enemy of the good here, because let's face it, we've had the brakes on this for 9 years, right? We've got a lot of catching up to do, haven't we? So can you talk to me about being on the bottom of the pecking order? And can I put on notice a question to the FCAI why that has been allowed to happen to Australia? I'll let you answer that question, and then I'll put one more on notice if I can, Chair.
Certainly. So ultimately, if we are at the bottom of the pecking order, how is it that we can demand the electric vehicles we need that will assist all Australians, and should we ultimately include hybrids in that, given it will be difficult to attract the best electric vehicles? Is that correct,
Yes.
Senator?
That's the reality, isn't it?
Well, yes, but in a sense it's being driven by numerous factors, of which the current government is looking to address some of them. Ultimately, at the end of the day, mandatory fuel efficiency standards are the number one thing that manufacturers say are necessary in order to bring the best vehicles here.
And the Minister announced that on Friday.
And the Minister announced that. And so I actually think that if we're looking at bringing the best electric vehicles here, which will benefit both regional and urban Australia, then in a sense the government's already putting a lot of that in train. And so we will look at what other policies, and we have a number of other policies that we believe will assist in electrification of transport that we could bring forward that are popular according to Climate of the Nation. But in a sense, some of those things are already in train right now. So I think that there is opportunity ahead.
And on notice, just if you could give us some of your thoughts on the benefits of a more coordinated national approach to EVs, and what role the National Electric Vehicle Strategy might play in coordinating efforts across government, industry, unions and consumer groups. Is that in the field of your research?
Yes, it is, Senator. We've done a fair bit of work both in the last Electric Vehicle Committee review, which was in 2018, I think, believed to be chaired by Senator Storer at the time. We reviewed many of the policies there. We've continued to review many of the policies and the real-world examples of what worked. The one recommendation that the previous government adopted out of the Storer review in 2019 was that they would bring forward an electric vehicle strategy. Unfortunately, that didn't actually happen. Instead, we had a future fuels strategy, the FFS, which fell short of actually doing anything to incentivise electric vehicles. I think there's a fair bit that could be done with a new policy, and would be excited to contribute to it.
And as you said, we're no longer car makers, car takers. That's a part of the problem, isn't it? Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Senator O'Neill. And that concludes the time that we have with the Australia Institute. So thank you both very much for appearing as witnesses for us today, and you go with our thanks.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you.
And I understand our next witnesses are ready and are appearing in person in Canberra. So as they're seating themselves, I'll formally welcome Dr. Diane Krall and Dr. Anna Mortimer. And I understand information on parliamentary privilege and the protection of witnesses giving evidence to Senate committees has been provided to you. And as you get yourselves seated, for the Hansard record, will you please state your full names and the capacity in which you appear today?
Okay, my name is Diane Krall and my submission is presented in the capacity of an individual.
Thank you, Dr. Krall.
I'm Dr. Anna Mortimer. My submission as well is as my submission, but it's also supported by our report to the race for 2030 regarding business fleets, the uptake of business fleets and looking at tax changes to support the uptake of business fleets. So my submission will be directed to our report.
Yes. Great. Thank you, Dr. Mortimer. I now invite you to make a short opening statement, and at the conclusion of that, I'll invite members of the committee to ask questions. Would you like to give an opening statement, or would you like us to go straight to questions?
Did you refer to myself or Anna? Because we've both got statements.
I think that, yes.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
If you'd like to go first, Dr. Krall, that would be great.
Okay, thank you. My submission specifically addresses the electric car discount bill and it makes 11 recommendations. The basis of my submission is the 2022 research report in which I participated as an academic for Monash University. The report name is Business Fleets and EVs, Taxation Changes to Support Home Charging from the Grid and Affordability. The collaborative research report had funding and input from industry partners that included the New South Wales Government, Victorian Government, Government of South Australia, AGL Australia and the Federal Department of Industry, Science, Energy and Resources. The three state governments in particular funded the project because they recognised a need to harmonise EV incentives across Australia. They agreed with the main objective to lower CO2 emissions nationally. Other key objectives included tax support for fleet transition to battery electric vehicles, also known as BEVs, BEV affordability and BEV home charging. The collaborative research report targets business and government fleets as the pathway to getting more EVs on the road because more than 40% of new light vehicle sales are to business. The report identifies BEV home charging as essential, but currently it's penalised by the tax system as it's considered private expenditure. The report recommends tax changes to support vehicle transition to BEVs. Fleet BEVs are important because they are rolled over to the private second-hand market only after a few years, encouraging wider community adoption of affordable BEVs. Short-term FBT changes as well as longer-term BEV and associated charging infrastructure rebates and subsidies will close that purchase price difference between BEVs and internal combustion cars. The research team shared their report in early 2022 with the FBT section of Treasury and the Department of Industry, Science, Energy and Resources. There are three main points that capture the essence of my submission, which is 11 recommendations. So just three key points that summarise it. First of all, carbon emissions reduction. The bill's context should contain the objective of carbon emissions reduction nationally. Number two, zero emission vehicles, otherwise known as ZEVs. Only ZEVs should be eligible for FBT exemptions. ZEVs are defined as battery electric vehicles and hydrogen fuel cell electric vehicles. It is recommended to remove FBT exemptions for internal combustion cars, which include hybrid cars and plug-in hybrid cars. And number three, the FBT cost impact on budget. The cost to the budget of FBT exemptions for ZEVs would be covered by removing FBT exemptions for internal combustion cars and applying FBT on a sliding penalty scale based on carbon emissions. In other words, the more carbon burned, the higher the rate of FBT. Thank you very much and happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Crowell. Dr. Mortimer,
Right.
do you have a opening statement?
Yes, I will. Yes, I'm Dr. Anna Mortimer, academic from Griffith University, and I'm a tax expert in taxation policy, economic instruments in reducing road transport emissions, which it was part of my PhD. So, following on from Dr. Crowell concerning our report, yes, we did recommend tax changes to accelerate the uptake of battery electric vehicles, the focus being on business fleets because it's much easier because of tax changes, we can directly introduce or change existing taxes to incentivise the uptake of business fleets for business. What we did in the project, the Race for 2030 project, we modelled and we used modelling to look at the current tax law and looking at to see whether they incentivise or are a disincentive for the uptake of EVs. We found that they are a disincentive, and the one that what we're talking about today is the fringe benefits tax. The focus now is just going through the explanatory memorandum to the law to the amendment to the fringe benefits tax, the FBT exemption for electric vehicles. Just picking up on that argument about whether the definition of low emission vehicles should be not include, should be changed. I believe that the terminology low emission vehicles can be misinterpreted and should not be used because low emission vehicles people could also believe it's HEVs, hybrid electric vehicles, but we're focusing on plug-in hybrid electric vehicles. Plug-in hybrid electric vehicles and BEVs could be, the general term is plug-in electric vehicles, so that's more appropriate. As to whether we should not include, my personal academic opinion is that in Europe at the moment, I know ACT is a little bit different, but in Europe, they have introduced regulatory standards since 2009. Right, we're talking about introducing standards most likely from next year, and to ban plug-in hybrid electric vehicles is not transitioning to EVs, but it's quite a hard call. It can be addressed in terms of the combustion. There's still the combustion engine, still emissions. There is the associated emissions, but if we look at countries like, for example, the UK, in their fringe benefits tax, they base their tax for plug-in hybrid electric vehicles depending on the electric range. So the higher the range of electric range, the lower is the taxes. So zero emissions can apply to plug-in hybrid electric vehicles, and they have in there for 130 miles, which is roughly about 200 kilometres. So yes, it needs to be monitored and addressed, but that is a possibility. Then looking at the interpretation regarding the amendment to the FBT for EVs. It talks about in section 1.2, the amendment is to encourage a greater uptake of electric vehicles by Australian road users and also by Australians. That does not explain the limited scope of this tax change. The fringe benefits tax applies to a car benefit available to an employee's private use, provided by employer to their employee in respect of employment. So fringe benefits tax does not apply to the employers. It does not apply to business owners or partners in a partnership. So it has a limited scope. It's not it's not for all Australian road users, so we need to acknowledge that. In section 2, it talks about encouraging a greater uptake of EVs. This is the only tax change at the moment. This change, this tax measure is what we call a demand-side measure. There are two sides to the equation, supply and demand. So the demand-side measure is meant to support the supply. We have a problem with supply. Supply of EVs. We do not have affordable EVs at the moment. So in order to encourage a greater uptake of EVs, this measure will be limited in its effect unless we can address supply. So, and that's at the moment, and in my submission in table 1, you will see the supply that we have of EVs. That was back in 2020, and they were all high-end EVs, or plug-in hybrid electric. They're all around about 100,000, 90,000. They were well over what the equivalent combustion fuel vehicle. There was a no-brainer why we don't have such a low uptake of EVs. The other point that was made is to make this exemption will make EVs more affordable. This depends on who is the employee and also how the vehicle is used, so and who supplies the EV. So, for instance, employees, let's assume we have employees on a novated lease, they choose their own vehicle. So if they're choosing their vehicle, and I give an example that we used in the project, which was, excuse me, I just need some water.
And Dr. Mortimer, I think my colleagues will have lots of questions for you that will go to some of what you're saying, so I might ask you to conclude.
Okay, so I'm just drawing from there the employees. You have employees in a novated lease, and you also have workfleet employees. Workfleet employees are given a fleet vehicle. Now, because they are workfleet home, 47% of business fleets are home garaged, they are automatically subject to FBT. Now, these fleet employees commence work from home. They go out, they're at work, they're high kilometres, and then they come back. They come back, if they've got an EV, what are they going to charge? They've got to charge their EV before they start work the next day. Obviously, home charging is a necessity. At the moment, home charging, or installing a home charger, you need to install a home charger to charge these vehicles quickly. That is not exempt from FBT. So that is a disincentive for fleet managers to transition their 47% of business fleets that are home garaged to EVs, because they will have to foot the bill, which is roughly around about $2,800 per vehicle, and we're talking about 34,000 vehicles. So that is just a no-brainer. And we need these business fleets to roll over into the second-hand market. And that is the reason, part of the reason is that there is only 488 EVs that were acquired by business and business fleets in 2020. It's a no-brainer. There is nothing flowing through to the second-hand market. This issue needs to be addressed. Otherwise, there will not be more affordable EVs in the second-hand market for all consumers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mortimer, and before you, Dr. Crowell. Just a quick question from me before I go to Senator Smith. The race report that you referred to, that you worked on, Dr. Mortimer in particular, found that FBT is a financial disincentive for business fleets to buy EVs, and that it should be removed, which is what this bill does. Is your evidence that you're supportive of that measure in the bill, but that you think that there are many more changes that could be made in this bill and more changes that need to happen overall? That's my question. Are you supportive of the measure, but you also think there's more that needs to be done?
Oh, definitely. The measure removes the tax, but does not address the cost gap. And the example I gave in the project was comparing like with like. A Kona, battery electric vehicles around about 66,000. The combustion fuel vehicle, Kona, is around about 31, right? The fringe benefits tax is 13,000. No one's going to buy that. Right, that's the reason why Kona only sells roughly around about 400 or 500 vehicles a year, and that has been like that for the last 3 years. So it removes the tax, but it does not address the cost gap. That's the reason why you need other tax measures to address the cost gap. This addresses the tax, but we need other measures. Instant asset write-off only applying to EVs. Accelerated depreciation only applying to EVs. They apply, they're there, but they apply to combustion fuel vehicles as well. So we're actually seeing both being reduced at the same time, but it's not addressed. It's got to be addressing the cost gap. That's why we're talking about it needs to be a combination of measures to address the tax, which this exemption is doing, and then now we need additional measures to address the cost gap.
And do you, just a quick follow-up from me, do you have views, or is it sort of outside your world as a tax specialist about the role that introducing fuel efficiency standards would have on dealing with that cost gap? Because as we all know at the moment, we're a dumping ground for petrol cars. Do you have views on fuel efficiency standards in assisting there?
Oh, definitely. I mean, they go, like I said before, they go hand in hand. So you've got the demand measures to support the supply, and at the moment there's none. So consequently, we just, car dealers can bring in anything they want, and they're naturally going to be bringing in vehicles that they can maximise their profit. So that's why it's always going to be lower priced. Euro 5. Now, Euro 5 compliant vehicles cannot be sold in the EU. They're Euro 6. They're even talking about going to Euro 7. So they cannot be sold. So these vehicles obviously are being sold in countries that have no regulatory standards. You bring in a standard, that then ceases to apply. So yes, it will, but when we're talking about we need the standards now, I think the panel needs to, like I said, Europe introduced standards from 2009 and have been progressing now 95 grams of CO2 by introduced in 2020, and that goes through to 2024. We're at 140, our national average in 2020 was 145 grams of CO2. That's a 50 gram average gram of CO2 difference. To bring in a standard immediately to meet that international standard is quite, could cripple industry in the sense that that's difficult. But we've got to bring in a supply of more affordable EVs. That really is, and the fact that the electric vehicle car manufacturers have made it quite clear that they are supplying EVs to countries that have regulatory standards. We don't have standards, so we are at the bottom of the queue, and we will stay there until standards are introduced.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'll go to Senator Smith.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Crowell and Dr. Mortimer. I just want to turn to your opening statement, Dr. Crowell, and you mentioned that the 2022 report had been shared with Treasury officials.
That's right.
Can you just sort of just explain that? So it was you met with them, you shared the research, there was an exchange, a discussion, or was it just provided to them? Just trying to, because it's clear to me it's obviously quite a comprehensive report. Secondly, yourself and Dr. Mortimer are clearly experts, so I'm trying to understand to what extent that substantive piece has informed this particular initiative before us, because you have brought forward 9 or 11 further improvements to the bill. So I'm just trying to get an understanding of what that consultation looked like.
In June of this year, we met with both the FBT section of Treasury as well as DISA. The representative from DISA organised the meeting. And this was before it was publicly released. And we just wanted to, as a matter of courtesy, share our results before it went out into the public forum, because we just wanted to make sure that those that had the most interest in an executive sense in this type of work would have, some sort of insight. So basically, it was just a presentation online and a discussion. So it was a Q&A type format. They were given a pre-publication copy of the report, and we didn't discuss any further as to what would actually go in the bill. That was basically our input as a matter of courtesy.
So of the 11 recommended changes, most of them deal with this theme about whether or not to include the plug-in hybrid electric vehicle. Is that, have I understood the 11?
That's correct. So, so first of all, the RACE project was all about lowering CO2 emissions in the area of EV in the grids. That was our remit. And also we had to look at affordability, and we had to look at benefits to the wider community. So even though the report was for fleets, the idea was that fleets will have impact if they transition from internal combustion cars to EVs, impact in terms of lowering CO2 emissions. And the beauty with fleets is that they only hang on to their cars for about 3 to 4 years, and they go into the second-hand market. And generally, fleet cars are quite well looked after. Yep. I've actually got a second-hand fleet car, and they're in demand. And so, in terms of impact, so the bigger picture is lowering CO2 emissions. Fleets were the best way to go because we were looking for impact, and so that's why we decided to focus on fleets. And so, going back to my changes, yes. So the framework is lowering of CO2 emissions, and those cars that are going to have the greatest impact in lowering CO2 emissions in the transport sector are zero-emission cars. Now, that's my view. There are various views out there, but I'm, it's a fairly, and people do get, I guess, passionate about this, but there has been a long delay between Australia doing anything, and we need to have that impact. The bill was before Parliament about, a reduction of 43% of CO2 emissions. We need impactful policies and legislation. And
yep. Do you also agree, because I don't think it was in your opening remark, about the negative effect of not including charging infrastructure in the concession? Do you agree?
Yes. So part and parcel of having a zero-emission vehicle is being able to charge it. And one of the big problems with business at the moment is that they don't have charging infrastructure, and many of them lease their premises anyway. So why would they invest in expensive charging infrastructure in rented or leased premises? And what we found with our research as to what they're doing overseas, and even in Australia, most people prefer to charge from home because it's more convenient. And the other bit of research is that 47% of fleet vehicles are actually driven home. So they're ready for charging at home. So really, to get that impact, to lower those CO2 emissions, we need tax support to take away that penalty for people to bring their car home, which is considered private.
I'd characterise it as the convenience part of the equation.
And it's also, from a productivity point of view, it makes sense. You're home, you charge it up, and you're ready for work the next day, because you don't want to get on the road, go to a public charging station, 15 minutes, 20 minutes, and then carry on with your work.
So just turning to the review mechanism, fast forwarding 3 years, what elements do you think should form the review? What are the measurements that should be looked at in deciding whether or not to continue the initiative?
Okay, so certainly, yes, there should be a review in 3 years, and you'd be looking at the uptake of cars in fleets, and there's plenty of statistics put out, annually
It's easy to
on that
measure.
sort of thing, and CO2 emissions, which is put out by, I'm pretty sure it's DISA, puts out CO2 emissions data. So the data is there, and it can be measured. And obviously, some sort of terms of reference would have to be drawn up. But in other legislations, quite often there are reviews, terms of references are drawn up, and a report, an investigation and a report is the result. And it's good practice because basically that's what the Europeans have been doing all these years. They've supported the uptake of electric vehicles through their tax system and rebates and subsidies, and they have constantly reviewed the effectiveness of that sort of support. And Norway's a good example. They had their registration exemption and VAT exemption, and now they've got up to about a 74% penetration of electric vehicles, and they've taken that support away because they've reached that threshold.
Yeah,
So
we're
the
a long way
Europeans
from
have been
there,
quite good at that.
Dr. Mortimer, in the evidence that you've given us, is it correct to paraphrase it this way, that the effectiveness of this measure would be enhanced if it was introduced with a suite of other measures at the same time?
Yes, definitely.
Yep.
If you look at, in our report,
Yep.
we looked at Norway, Netherlands, United Kingdom and Germany, and we brought that to the attention of Treasury, we've laid out all the policies. So it's not just one policy, it's a combination of policy. The combination of policy is why the uptake of EVs has significantly increased. In that document and that policy, we've got plug-in hybrid electric vehicles and we've got BEV, so there are both. But what you will notice is that there is a transition happening in all of those countries where the plug-in hybrid electric vehicles are reducing the sales uptake and BEVs are increasing. But if you look behind that, you look behind the policies is what is driving that transition. So that can apply here.
Two final questions for you both. Have you been able to quantify the number of vehicles that will be taken up as a result of this particular tax measure?
Well, what we've done, one of our industry partners was AGL, and I cite AGL's prediction of what electric vehicles will be by 2030, but they prepared those figures before we started this report. So certainly our report was completed over a period of about a year, and the next phase will be looking at the effectiveness of some of these policies. So we've got short-term and long-term tax changes in fringe benefits tax and income tax. We know that the short-term fringe benefits tax, which generally is in this bill, will go part of the way to reducing the price gap, but not all the way. Mm-hmm. So it's probably a little bit too early to do that sort of prediction, but certainly I would commend this bill. It's a fantastic step forward, and certainly the 3-year mark or even earlier, we need to look at its effectiveness.
Excuse me, Dean, can I, Senator Dean, can I add to that? We mentioned that, and why it was interesting with work fleet vehicles, and this was from a survey by AFMA and AGL, where they said that 47% of business fleets are home garage. That represents roughly around about 34,000
Yeah, you did
vehicles.
mention that in the other.
So if we directed these changes and addressed businesses' concern, and business is much easier to particularly where they are home charging, because you've got charging, not workplace charging. So if this can be addressed, there is already, you can see, a large uptake of EVs in the workplace, in the work fleet vehicles, and they are probably critical to roll over into the second-hand market.
Our final question from me. If the review found that there was a higher proportion of plug-in vehicles that utilise this initiative, a higher proportion of plug-in vehicles than other vehicles. Would you regard this initiative as having failed?
No, definitely not. Netherlands is a good example, and if I could go back to the amendment to be for this policy to be reviewed after 3 years, I don't agree with that. This review should be happening yearly because there are so many issues. There's a supply issue. This is a demand measure, right, which is supporting supply. You don't have supply. So does that mean if this fails in 3 years because we haven't addressed supply, then this incentive has failed? That's not necessarily the case. It's just that it hasn't been supported by other measures. What you were just mentioning before, we haven't got tax changes that could address the cost gap. So if you have a cost gap addressed, you've got, and yes, Netherlands is a good example because they monitor, and again, we've only been told that the fringe benefits tax exemption will be there for 3 years, right? If you look at all the other countries, they give an overview of what the taxes will be over 5 years. So that in itself could be a disincentive. I mean, I would be thinking, I'd be worried, is this exemption going to be removed? That means I'm back to paying fringe benefits tax.
I accept that point, and it's a point that's made in some further submissions, absolutely. So having an annual review might actually
Thank you, Senator Smith.
provide better calibration of the...
Definitely, and you could then tweet the taxes applicable to not fully exempt plug-in hybrid electric vehicles, and that happened in the UK. We talked about, I know Chris Bowen has mentioned the UK, but for example, plug-in hybrid electric vehicles that have only 48 battery capacity of only 48 kilometres, their tax is 12%.
Right, gotcha.
Chair, can I just make
Thank
one
you.
more...
Thank you, Senator. Thank you, Senator Smith.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm going to go to Senator Pocock, then Senator Rice, then Senator O'Neill, and I'll just note that we've got a few minutes left. We're going to go a bit over time, but if senators could just notice the time. Thank you, Senator Pocock.
Thank you, Chair. With time in mind, I might put a few questions on notice rather than asking them all, if that's all right. But Dr. Kral, I'm really interested in your view on whether or not including hybrid vehicles in this is a bit like the government saying that they committed to net zero, but they're also going to explore for oil and gas. Like, is this an example of trying to have it both ways, or are there legitimate
look,
concerns there?
We're both academics here, and we don't always necessarily agree. My view is that they should be zero emission vehicles. And I also mentioned in my submission that there should also be a penalty regime in FBT that links to emissions. So the higher the emissions, the higher the FBT rate. So you've got zero emission cars, which are battery electric vehicles, and the hydrogen fuel cell vehicles, which would be considered zero emissions, so fully exempt from FBT, and then the scale goes up. As there are emissions from a particular car, the higher the emissions, the more the FBT. So that basically, deals with that question. But obviously there are differing views.
And would you support including electric vehicle conversions of utes and Land Cruisers? There's a couple of Australian companies starting to do that for the mining industry and sort of tradies.
Yes, well, certainly the mining industry, in terms of the heavy equipment, they use electric vehicles. But anyway, our concern, is in the light vehicle class, and at the moment there's an FBT exemption specifically for utes and vans, and that's why we see so many of our tradespeople out on the road in those sorts of cars, because they have FBT exemption. So what I'm saying in my submission is that it's only zero emission cars in the van and ute class that should be exempt from FBT. So that consequential amendment must be made to maintain the integrity of this bill.
Great, thank you. And Dr. Mortimer, maybe just a couple of questions on notice, if that's all right. Do you have a view on whether or not this should have a sunset clause? And if you do, what should that sunset clause be? And then just earlier talking about the need for the concession to also go to home charging infrastructure costs. It'd be great to see if you have actually looked at the cost savings to fleet owners from having electric vehicles in terms of maintenance and not having fuel cards, that sort of thing, versus the upfront cost of home charging infrastructure. I'd love to see that.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Senator Pocock. Senator Rice.
Thank you. Look, and maybe this is also a question on notice. In terms of your proposal, Dr. Crowell, for a FBT sliding scale, and you said that the costs of this could be covered by that sliding scale. Have you modelled that, and have you provided that to us? Or if so, maybe you could.
No, we haven't modelled it. We only modelled some selected recommendations because we had basically a one-year project, and the idea was to go into phase 2. But certainly, after that type of modelling, Senator Rice.
I think that would be really valuable to the committee as to what could be done by having that sliding scale of FBT.
Yeah, I think the
good solution.
The best thing I might do is find out what they are doing overseas, because we've taken account of what's been successful overseas, those countries that have really lowered their CO2 emissions through the greater uptake of EV. So I might respond to your question on notice by providing that sort of positive overseas information.
That would be great. My other, I wanted to know, you just replied to a question from Senator Smith that you wouldn't consider it a failure if this SBT exemption resulted in it all being applied to hybrid vehicles. That seemed to be a bit at odds with your position that this bill shouldn't apply to hybrid vehicles.
Okay. No, look, I wouldn't use the term failure. I think it's a little bit too strong. I think it's a really good bill, and these 11 recommended changes are given in a positive way to improve it. So, in order to get around this thorny question of hybrid, plug-in hybrid vehicles, again, the FBT on a sliding scale, the more emissions, the higher the FBT charge, would deal with that issue.
Okay, and finally, I sort of got through both of your submissions that given the measures that you were saying should also be imposed, that there was a bit of a concern that this bill as it stands is not going to be so effective in reducing emissions, but is the main thing it's going to achieve is making electric vehicles more affordable for people that are already on higher incomes. Is that a fair summation?
Yes, well, again, my submission is based on the race report, and our remit was to look at lowering CO2 emissions through fleet cars, bearing in mind that the cars had to be affordable. So we're saying change from ICEVs to EVs, so they had to be affordable, and also from a supply point of view, access to the wider community, not just the business community, which is important, but somehow make a positive impact for the wider community, and that is through the second-hand market, the cars rolling from fleets into the second-hand market. So that was basically our remit.
Senator...
Right, and so look, I'll go on.
Sorry, well, just in the report we did modelling, and we did model the exemption of FBT for business fleets. Business is different the way they acquire vehicles. They look at the total cost of ownership. So they look at the cost gap, yes, but can we spread that out across the ownership period, 3 or 4 years? We found that with that example of the Kona, that the over a 4-year period and exempting FBT for fleet vehicles, but on the condition that combustion fuel vehicles still used the statutory formula method, because that adds to the cost of the combustion fuel vehicle. We found that the cost parity did reduce significantly. That may be the difference in the price parity, or the difference in the prices may be acceptable to business. But that only works if you use that particular method of FBT. Unfortunately, most businesses use the logbook method, which means low private use, and then you've got that cost difference problem again.
Right, so it's not actually going to be effective then?
Well, it will be effective, but you've got to virtually delete them using the logbook method, which
Right.
won't go down too well.
Can I just ask my final question on this issue of affordability, because I think it's really crucial. What would you see being the number one things that the government should be doing to be making electric vehicles more affordable for people?
Yeah. So again, the bill encapsulates our short-term FBT recommendations. We made a series of long-term recommendations which are in the form of rebates and subsidies. And at the time we thought, okay, what's most palatable and achievable in the short term? And those recommendations, as I say, are contained in the bill here, but we need to do some more work to close that price gap between a BEV and an ICEV.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. Senator O'Neill.
Thank you, Chair. I'll try and be as quick as I can. Could you just clarify for me, Dr Mortimer, what the 488 in 220 was that you were referring to in your earlier evidence?
The uptake of electric vehicles by business and business fleets, 488 vehicles.
Across the entire country?
This is figures produced by the National Transport Commission, and they outline what the uptake of business, consumers and so forth. So just for business and business fleets, it was 488 electric vehicles.
So I thought that that's what you said, but I really wanted to make sure that we really noted that, because it's all, I love to anticipate a bright future. I'm in politics because I believe, and I'm a hopeful person, but if there are only 488 cars coming on board and you've described a supply issue, we are not in a position after 9 years of inaction by the previous government to exclude cars that are hybrid, really, are we?
Well, this is a part of the transition, so we should be looking at this as part of the transition. But as I mentioned to you before, it can be controlled. There is what has been said is accurate, is correct, but it needs to be reviewed on a regular basis. When we're talking about review, making sure, like you were saying before, that we're not seeing a surge in the supply of plug-in hybrid electric vehicles that are basically
with no
small,
supply of
So you
zero
can,
electric vehicles.
and that's what the other countries have done. They've introduced, I think it's Netherlands, they have specific taxes for plug-in hybrid electric vehicles. So it's to control. And then what you see when they introduced the change, the sales of plug-in hybrid electric vehicles fell, but then the battery electric vehicle sales increased. So it really is monitoring.
As supply becomes available, there's sufficient room to calibrate this to
definitely.
attend to that reality. But at the moment, we are looking down the barrel of a massive supply problem. Can I go to the evidence you gave, Ms. Krull and Dr. Krull? I want to thank you both for excellent submissions and great evidence today. The AGL data that's referred to in much of the evidence that we have before us in these submissions, what date was that?
They provided that information to us at the start of our research, which was 2019.
So we're talking pre-COVID. The world supply chains have changed considerably since then. So I think that's really important, that the context of that data is on the public record as well as we discuss the detail. Finally, because we're running out of time, I might put some more on notice. Including asking you for a response to the NALSPA submission, particularly around ATO guidance and uncertainty about what's in, what's out, older definitions around FBT eligibility with regard to cars and what is a car expense. So if you could have a look at that, particularly in their submission, page 4. Can I go back to the section of your submission, Dr. Mortimer, where you talk about what's at play in the international movement of cars. The second last paragraph on page 3 refer to EV car manufacturers bypassing Australia. And you refer to the Managing Director of VW Australia, Mr. Barch, who has made it known, you say, that Australia's lax environmental standards is a disincentive to bring EVs because the profit earned from combustion fuel vehicles is simply too high, and a lack of incentive, Australia would go to the back of the queue. Mm-hmm. Could you expand on, the kind of regulatory and legal environment that has enabled that, and how difficult is the transition given that? What needs to happen?
Well, I think this is a start, what we're doing with fringe benefits tax. It's definitely a start. We need to engage with, I think the car manufacturers have made it quite clear.
You're all offshore.
Yes, regulation's important, obviously, and we need to, but it's got to be supported strongly by more demand type measures, and one of them is the FBT. Business trying to influence business fleets because they don't look at that cost gap. That doesn't put them off, whereas a consumer would, right? So that way we can work out with do tax changes to then reduce that cost gap. So long as it works for business over the total cost of ownership, they're open to looking at fleet vehicles. But yes, and they made this point that why look at the installing infrastructure, charging infrastructure, when it's not cost competitive by EVs. So if it's not cost competitive, they're not going to be investing in installing infrastructure. And that is a major problem with business. So all of these issues need to be addressed. And yes, there needs to be, and I think if car manufacturers can see they are going to be able to sell these vehicles, they will be here.
So there's a market failure in terms of investment for the infrastructure to provide charging?
Well, as we were saying before, home charging is preferred, and so that probably would definitely be encouraged. And I think by our report, that's the reason why we went and looked at business fleets, because business fleets, as I said, you can try to probably look at that cost gap and then try to reduce that cost gap, and also the importance of rolling over to the second-hand market. That 488 is terrible, and we have consumers being surveyed and saying, yes, we want to buy an EV, we can't afford it, but they can't even buy one in the second-hand market. So that, to me, is a major flaw that needs to be addressed.
Thank you. So many more questions, Chair, but I might have to put them on notice, I'm afraid. We're all already over time. Thank you.
And what was that
ATO? I think that
the statement, it's NAUSPA, but the Secretary will be in touch with you in writing to make sure that you have the questions clearly.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator O'Neill, and thank you both very much, Dr. Kral and Dr. Mortimer, for your evidence today. That concludes the time that we have for you. Thank you very much for appearing as witnesses, and you go with our thanks. And I know we've kept our next witnesses waiting a little while. Apologies for that. But as you approach your seats, I now welcome representatives from the National Automotive Leasing and Salary Packaging Association. I understand that information on parliamentary privilege and the protection of witnesses giving evidence to Senate committees has been provided to you. I'll just note to the Secretariat that I can no longer see the table where the witnesses are appearing, and I'm not sure if that's at your end.
They're being seated right now, Chair.
Being seated. Thank you, Senator O'Neill. So that will allow me, while that's being fixed, to at least say that for the Hansard record, to our new witnesses, will you please state your full names and the capacity in which you appear today?
I'll kick off. Rowan Martin, Secretary and Director of NAUSPA and a Group Executive with the Macmillan Shakespeare Group.
BJ Aldersai, Director of NAUSPA and an Executive of Smart Group Corporation. David Fernandez, similar, also executive of SG Fleet Group and director at Nelspa as well.
Greg Kent, partner at PricewaterhouseCoopers, tax advisors for Nelspa.
Shane Pinto, director at PricewaterhouseCoopers and tax advisor to Nelspa.
Okay, thank you all. I'm hoping that not each of you will have an opening statement, that you may have nominated one of you to give an opening statement, and I'm going to invite you to do that. And at the conclusion of any remarks, we'll have the committee ask questions.
Thank you, Chair. And no, we won't be doing 5 minutes each of introductions. Just to Chair and members, we welcome you very much. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today. And as we've heard, we're joined by 2 of our Nelspa members and directors, and also PwC, who are our FBT and taxation advisors. Just briefly about us, Nelspa is the peak industry body for the salary packaging and novated lease sector. Our members help over 800,000 working Australians use their pre-tax salary to package a number of different employment-related benefits, with one of the key benefits provided being a motored vehicle via a novated lease. Our members currently administer around 425,000 vehicles, with just under half of those being employer-provided salary package or novated leases, with employers stretching across the non-for-profit sector, health, government and private sectors in metro, regional and rural Australia. And the other balance of the 425,000, just over half, are what we call tool of trade vehicles that we understand this bill will apply to as well. Overall, vehicles that are subject of a novated lease are a much younger, healthier and environmentally friendly car park than the overall Australian car park, and represent approximately 10% of new car sales in Australia. Certainly our members wholeheartedly embrace the electrification of the Australian vehicle fleet, and in serving over 800,000 PAYG earners and managing the volume of vehicles that we do, I suppose we have a good insight, informed understanding into the way that Australians purchase and operate and finance their vehicles. Certainly we are looking to work with policymakers to ensure that salary packaging, which is an embedded remuneration practice across Australian workplaces, plays a meaningful and targeted role in helping to drive employer and employee understanding and ultimately take up of zero and low emission vehicles. Nelspa certainly supports a clear national and targeted policy framework as the foundation for an orderly and successful long-term transition that preserves consumer choice and provides accessible EV benefits to Australians. Nelspa has recently engaged advisory services firm Deloitte to identify strategies that have been delivered successful EV transitions in other global jurisdictions, and a summary of this research has been provided to the committee members. Importantly, this research shows that successful transitions are nuanced to local context and multifaceted to address differing needs. We commend the federal government's commitment to provide an FBT exemption for certain electric cars, and as such we fully support the introduction of the bill. It will assist to bring such vehicles into price parity with their petrol and diesel equivalents. And that's critical for Australian workers whom we serve. The employees who salary package via our members typically earn below $100,000 per annum and have an average spend of approximately around about $40,000 on a vehicle, with only probably a small handful that sit above the LCT level. The typical $20,000, what we call a $20,000 differential in the sticker price between an EV and their petrol and diesel equivalent today puts EVs beyond the reach of many average working Australians. Nelspa believe that the proposed FBT exemption is a significant initiative, in part to help address this in part. That being said, we contend there is a need to further amend and where appropriate make clarification to the current electric car discount bill in order to most effectively promote and encourage an increase in the take-up of such vehicles. Importantly, we also want to ensure that any unintended consequences are satisfactorily addressed prior to finalisation of the bill. As per our submission, we have made a total of 7 recommendations for the consideration of the committee, with probably 2 standing out for us. Firstly, we believe the bill should be amended to provide longer-term certainty in terms of its application. Currently, the bill provides for a 3-year exemption period, which is less than the average lease duration, which is around about 4 years, and doesn't take into account that there can be up to a 2-year wait on some very popular EVs. This will cause some both procedural and cost uncertainty for people looking to salary package an EV or employers who are looking to acquire one, and ultimately may diminish the effectiveness of the legislation. And secondly, extending the application of the bill to include costs associated with zero and low emission vehicles such as in-home charging cost will assist to address the additional barriers as employers and employees look to transition from petrol to or from petrol and diesel to an EV. So again, thank you, and we'd welcome any questions from the committee.
Thank you very much. I'll just kick off with one question and then head over to you, Senator Rice, and then go to you, Senator Bragg. You said in your opening statement and your submission that you administer some sort of hundreds of thousands of vehicles on behalf of employers. I'm assuming that a very small proportion of those at the moment are electric vehicles, and interested to know if you have information about what proportion might be plug-in hybrids that will also be covered by this. But my question is really, is there demand to make this transition? And with the sort of measure that we're discussing here, the FBT exemption, how quickly do you see the transition to EVs in the cars that you manage potentially occurring over time?
Yep, thank you. In terms of the percentage take-up within novated leasing, it would broadly represent what we see in the centre in the broader Australian market, which new car sales or plug-in hybrids and BEVs represent around about 2% of new car sales, and novated leasing wouldn't be very much different from that. Obviously, with price and the significant price impost of an EV being a barrier that everyone in the Australian community has today, plus a lack of a range of availability of a product. 70% of what Australians buy are either SUV or dual cabs, and there's not an EV or battery electric vehicle within that market. Today, the plug-in hybrids would also represent a similar percentage to the broader population. Certainly from salary packaging providers, once the bill passes both the houses, it's something that can be implemented very quickly. Already, certainly the businesses and members have done a lot of work in the background, and there is a lot of interest from the client and customer base around this particular initiative. So there is a lot of what I call it pent-up demand. The issue will come in terms of availability of vehicles, however, where it's often a 6 to 12 month wait for these vehicles. And in fact, for some, it can be up to a 2-year wait. So, whilst, we've got certain comments around the bill, we are keen for it to see in market or to be finalised and become law as quickly as possible so that we can begin to start to work with our clients and customers on their transition. One of the questions, and we've heard through some of the other groups, is around about what impact you think longer term this bill will have on the take-up. Again, that's going to very much dependent on what the available supply is. And in the work that we submitted to the committee and through modelling that we had done via Deloitte, their view was that by assuming this went out to at least 2030, that it would lift the take-up of battery electric and plug-in hybrid by around about 15% by 2030, which would be, based on what the Australian population purchase today, would be around about 150,000 vehicles per annum. That assumes we've got greater supply in terms of the timeline, and also greater range in terms of more SUV, dual cabs, etc. So ultimately, we think that given the widespread application of the fringe benefits tax and the use by businesses and employees and employers, we think that ultimately it can make a significant difference in terms of reducing our emissions and seeing a far greater take-up in terms of ZL EVs. And please, gentlemen, if there's anything else I want to add to.
I did say that I just had one question, but I'm just going to use the privilege of the chair and follow up on Deloitte modelling. Did that include consideration of the flow on to the second-hand market, or was that just that 15% just new car sales?
That's new car sales only, and again, predicated on being greater availability, and certainly that's one of the benefits that we see of the FBT regime and of salary package vehicles and employer-provided vehicles. Their averaging at least is probably about 4 years, so these vehicles are turned over quite quickly. So one of the benefits that you'll see through this particular bill is that you'll see more ZL EVs in the secondary market. So what does that do? It'll encourage OEMs to bring in more vehicles. We'll then see more in the second-hand market, which will be more at a more affordable price points for the general populace.
Thank you. Senator Rice.
Thanks, Chair, and thank you for your submission and for your evidence. And look, I wanted to start by following up the questions that the Chair was just asking you in terms of proportion and what difference this bill is going to make. I mean, your submission says that it's about 10% of sales, about 115,000 new cars occur through novated leases. Do you think that this bill will make a difference in that? Will it make novated leases for zero and low emission vehicles more popular, and so increasing that? That's my first question.
Yep. David, do you want to share the love?
Sure. Sorry. Absolutely. So I think the short answer to the question is yes. I think that's likely. Obviously, it's difficult to give any kind of absolute around that. I'd be very confident, though, to say that I think we will see people transition from a traditional ICE vehicle to an electric vehicle. So within that existing car park of 10%, I would see that as well too. I think the broader piece, though, that's probably worth discussing a bit more. I know we are here as NALSPAR today, but we also provide general vehicle fleet management for tool of trade type vehicles, and that, in terms of the application of the bill, is probably the bigger opportunity. So we have a number of, as I say, tool of trade fleets that are looking at electrification quite actively. It fits very well with their ESG policies and where they want to go as businesses as well too. But there are some fairly significant barriers, and the previous witnesses also touched on this as well. Probably the two biggest barriers that we see are that total cost of ownership, that as it stands today, the electric vehicles are significantly more expensive, and even though there are arguable reductions in the running costs and the cost of the fuel, there are still costs of the fuel. Because of that purchase price, that price parity isn't there right now. So certainly for any fleet looking to transition from one to the other, there's an impost. There is a cost impost today. And that, I just would stress, is probably from an overall Australian perspective, that's actually the bigger opportunity than just novated leases. The second piece in there, in terms of what are the barriers and what's going to prevent that transition, would also be that charging infrastructure issue. So those tool of trade fleets, they're active vehicles, they're moving, and that's the primary reason why the employer is providing that vehicle to the employee. So they don't really have that opportunity necessarily to go to the workplace and charge them at the workplace, and they will be heavily dependent on the home charging. So in terms of those kind of two, in answer to your question, yes, I do think this would be supportive of a transition for both novated leases and for tool of trade vehicles, but there are still a couple of significant impediments in there as well too.
And I think we'll also see interest in novated leasing, particularly from a larger cohort of small to medium enterprises where people want to acquire an EV, and this will be a very cost-effective way for them to do that. So we certainly think that it will drive significantly more interest in EVs through this particular bill.
So have you got any forecasting or modelling as to how many EVs or plug-in hybrids that will be taken up under novated leases compared with that, the current number that's at 115,000?
Yeah. As just per my previous comments, the only information we have to date, the modelling is around what was completed by Deloitte, which they estimated that by 2030 we would see, in terms of salary packaging, novated lease vehicles, we would see that an increase of 15%. So you'd have 15% of all new vehicles being acquired via a novated lease for battery electric and plug-in hybrid by 2030. And they've based that off the business tax write-off that was been in place in the UK, and what the difference there, the delta that they saw. Again, those numbers are difficult to accurately predict because it relies on supply.
Yeah, absolutely.
And
Can I just ask what date the Deloitte report that you're referring to was produced?
2 months ago, I think.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right,
yes,
so-
it's current.
Yeah, but
Yep.
they have a different supply situation in the UK because they are already advanced in their transition.
Yes, and the Deloitte modelling was also predicated on being additional supply of additional models into the Australian market. So that means more dual cabs and more SUVs. So it was predicated at the moment. Obviously, we've got a small car park in terms of what's availability to consumers, but that was predicated on. But we think that one of the advantages and one of the positives of this bill is that it does send the right message to OEMs. The OEMs that we've talked to said it's great that various states are doing things, $3,000 subsidy in South Australia or elsewhere, but they supply to countries and they need to see a nationally consistent approach and adoption, and we think that this goes to part way towards sending the message to them to supply more product into the Australian market.
Thank you, Senator Rice.
Yeah. Thank you, Senator. Going back to that Deloitte modelling, and which, obviously there are a number of factors at play as to how accurate it's going to be. Does it go into what proportion of sales will be zero electric, i.e. battery electric, and what proportion will be plug-in hybrids?
Look, I'll have to take that on notice. I think it may have only been BEVs, because when they completed that analysis, we didn't have the details of the bill, and we were unsure at that time as to whether it would include battery electric and plug-ins. We think, we think the inclusion of plug-ins is very wise, because we think a lot of Australians and a lot of companies will transition to plug-in hybrid vehicles rather than immediately BEV. But I'll take that on notice and just confirm that.
Okay, on that and your support for including plug-in hybrids, what do you think of the proposal that was put forward by our previous witnesses of actually having a sliding scale of fringe benefits tax? It's like based on carbon emissions, so that you would have the complete exemption for zero emissions vehicles, but for plug-in hybrids, you would still have some fringe benefits tax that would be applied.
Greg, did you want to?
We've seen sliding scales apply before in other fringe benefits tax contexts with vehicles. They were removed by a previous government. The challenge with the sliding scales is it brings in complexity. So whilst that would, as a suggestion, I can see the merit in doing that, the sliding scale brings in complexity in terms of compliance, which is a natural barrier to employers sort of following through with that. So I think there's a positive and a negative way to look at that.
Yeah. And I might just add to that. I mean, statistics we run is I think FBT represents 1% of the sort of national tax collected, but surveys conducted from employers constantly paraded as the most difficult tax to comply with administratively. And so I think anything that adds to administrative complexity, particularly in large fleets where you might have to start picking different portions of the fleet to apply different rates to, that actually needs to be balanced against what we're trying to achieve. So there are other factors at play.
Well, it might actually encourage flex to say that they need to go with fully battery electric rather than hybrids, which are going to continue to be polluting and defeating the purpose of what we're trying to achieve. I note that you said that you want to extend the exemption to include other costs, ancillary costs. Does that include home charging infrastructure?
Yep, definitely. I don't know, Greg, do you want to comment on that again?
Yeah, so that obviously the bill is very targeted on the cost price of vehicles. There are a range of additional costs that go with maintaining a car. The silence around the charging infrastructure and associated costs creates, I guess, a natural barrier for people who may be looking at this measure, looking at the exemption as the means to invest in a zero emission or low emission vehicle as something that they wouldn't have otherwise gone into. And so where you've got secondary costs that aren't associated with similar exemptions or afforded similar exemptions, it's just a cost. It's a cost barrier. We work quite closely.
Do you have any estimates of what those costs, what that is, what your customers would end up having to pay for those?
Look, Senator, there's different units. I think one we've got in our submission there from the sort of leading provider, Jet Charge. It's about $1,700 for the hardware, and an average home installation would be around about $800. So it's a couple of $2,500 probably at a minimum. So when you already have concerns about the cost of acquiring the asset in terms of the EV, that's another factor. If someone typically was just to plug their EV into a 240 volt AC, it would charge at about 10 kilometres an hour, so which is very slow. So therefore, there's a significant percentage of, we think, of EV and plug-in hybrid owners that will need significantly faster units than that in order to accommodate for their daily lives, and particularly if they're bringing home fleet vehicles. So we think that, and we've looked at other jurisdictions, as we've talked about through our work with Deloitte, and most other jurisdictions where they've had significant uptake of EVs, they've provided support for home charging. The work that we've seen and the research that we've seen says that around about 80% of all charging will be done at home. So sometimes I think there's a bit of a misconception that most of the charging, because today what do? We go to a fuel station externally, fill our vehicles. In future with an EV or a plug-in hybrid, we won't need to do that, all to the same extent, and we will do that at home.
Yeah, and just to make one additional comment, some of the costs or the additional costs would fall under the definition of car expenses and therefore would benefit from the exemption, which additionally includes it, but it's the capital type infrastructure costs that aren't eligible for those exemptions. The Tax Office, Australian Taxation Office, is in the process of providing and considering a lot of guidance around this, but they haven't released anything yet around electric vehicles. Our expectation based on tax law in general is that there will be a divider between capital costs versus running, and if you compare it to an ICE vehicle, it's the difference between getting a deduction for the fuel costs, but you don't, if you went and bought a petrol Bowser, you wouldn't, that's a capital cost, right? So same with the infrastructure.
One last quick question, just in terms of your association. I just wanted to confirm that you donate tens of thousands of dollars to both the Labor and the Liberal Party each year. Is this a practice that's ongoing?
So that was about our political contributions, was it?
Yes, that's right.
Look, we make contributions across the political spectrum and in terms of the support of democracy in Australia, and we'll continue to do that.
And to both the Labor, you don't donate to the Greens, just to the Labor and the Liberal parties?
Sorry, we don't.
Well, I mean, we wouldn't accept a donation from you as a Greens party, but so it's just the Labor and Liberal parties that you donate to?
We donate as we declare in terms of Labor. We've done Liberal and National Party as well.
Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Senator Rice. Senator Bragg.
Thanks very much, Chair. I just wanted to get some basic information down. So to start with, how many cars are there in Australia?
In the total of the Australian car park, I think there's about 18 million, isn't it?
Yeah, broadly speaking, don't quote us on that figure.
Yes.
18 million? Okay. And how many new cars are sold each year?
Around about a million, a bit more, maybe 1.1. I think last month there might have been 120,000 vehicles.
And how many of those are you saying 200,000 are being run by your members, is that right?
There's around about, all up there's around about 425,000, of which just under half are novated leases.
Okay, so 200,000 of the 18 million are novated leases, yeah?
There's probably, there'd be around about probably 400,000 in the market today. If you take it, there's around about...
Novated leases, okay.
There's around about 100,000 purchased via a novated lease per annum, average lease term around about 4 years, so therefore there's about 400,000 of the Australian car park. And I think the average vehicle has something of, an average age of about 10.1 years.
Okay. I mean, it's up to you if you want to check those figures on notice. I'm just trying to work out how big this change is going to be in a relative sense, because I'm trying to work out how many cars is it actually going to capture if the Parliament enacts it. And it sounds like you're saying that it could capture up to 100,000 a year.
Yeah, David, do you want...
Sorry, the application of the bill is somewhat wider. I think the questions are directed more towards novated leases, but the application of the bill is significantly broader than that. So the bill applies to any vehicle where the employer is providing the vehicle that can be garaged at home overnight. That does include a novated lease, but much more broadly, that includes a lot of these tool of trade vehicles. So fleets of sales representatives.
Yeah, okay. So for example, you're talking about a tradesperson that's putting a ute through their business. Is that what you?
Yes, that's a good example. Or the employees, probably more to the point, the employees of that business who might also be provided with a vehicle to go to and from work and home. In terms of the number, so of new vehicles that go into the marketplace, the long-term average is closer to 50% or just under 50%. In the current year, it's a little bit lower than that at the moment, to be honest. But I think that's a short-term trend, which is more to do with just supply of vehicles at the moment.
Okay.
So the application of the bill is quite wide.
Yeah. Okay. So I guess I'm just trying to get a sense of it. So of the 1 million new vehicles sold in Australia this year, how many vehicles do you think these policies, if they were passed by Parliament, would apply to?
So up to the maximum would be around 40 to 45%, depending on what the final mix is of business vehicles versus private registrations. Now, within that 40...
to 450,000, let's say.
That's right. Now, the key thing in there, which I don't actually have any kind of ready statistics on, though, is what proportion of those vehicles would be garaged at home. So some of those those business vehicles are purely used for business purposes and never go to the residence of the employee.
So there needs to be some private benefit in the use of those vehicles.
That's right.
Okay. Well, I mean, we'll try and get a sense of it from the Treasury Department as well, but I think it's a useful exercise for us to go through to work out how broad is this change going to be, because I have to say to you that your evidence actually makes it sound broader than I personally anticipated that it would be, right? It is what it is. Okay.
Progress, we call it. Senator Bragg, progress.
That's right.
And the other thing here is we talked about before that we think that this will create broader and wider appeal, given that this will be, a very prudent way in terms of acquiring a low zero emission vehicle.
Okay. And can you just give me a sense of the average price of a car which is purchased under a novated lease versus the average price of a car purchased using the FBT rules, but not necessarily a novated lease?
It's a difficult one, but broadly, I'd say very similar, to be honest. So in terms of if we could call them tool of trade vehicles versus a novated lease vehicle, just for the purposes of the distinction, the tool of trade vehicle will be between $40,000 and $45,000, and so the novated lease vehicle would be very similar.
Yeah, novated would average around the early 40 mark.
Okay, and how much do you think the average, do you have a sense of how much the average EV would be under these changes?
Today, I think the cheapest EV is probably around, 43, 44, maybe for an MG or one of the newer Chinese brands. So they're probably averaging, to be honest, it's probably closer to 65, 70. Tesla makes up, about 60% of the Australian market. So if you talk about Tesla 3, you're talking about sort of 70, 70s to 80. So I'd say at the moment, we say for a typical, if it was a Hyundai that was a petrol vehicle and a Hyundai that was an electric vehicle, today there's about a $20,000 price differential between the two. If you have virtually the identical car, but one had a BEV, one was a BEV, and the other one was a petrol, there's around about a $20,000 difference.
Okay, my last question is just a reflection you may want to give us on some of the evidence we've heard at this committee, which is that if these changes are enacted, there may be issues with supply, because there are issues with supply anyway.
Yep.
Have you given much thought as to how the supply issues could be relieved?
Supply issues. Well, that's in our sector at the moment. That's a $64 question. But as we talked about earlier on, that I think it's really important that Australia develops a nationalised and harmonised approach in terms of our transition. We think that will send a strong message to OEMs about the provision of supply of EVs here. We've also, there's been obviously a lot of talk around vehicle emission standards, which from our sector and from our sector cohorts has support, as long as obviously that's in a measured way that's sensible for the Australian market. Plus, there's a number of other things. Education is absolutely critical. There's a lack of awareness and understanding about battery electric and low emission vehicles. And there's other measures that we've seen in other jurisdictions, the ability to use bus lanes, the ability to provide free parking. There's a whole other range, centre of other initiatives that we think ultimately we need to consider in terms of modernisation of the tax regime as well, that ultimately will help to, once they all come together, or in part, they will assist to start to address, I think, the supply issue into Australia, but understanding that supply chains globally, not just across the auto sector, as we know it, are being disrupted, and that will continue for some period of time.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Thanks.
Thank you, Senator Bragg. Senator O'Neill, do you have a question?
I do have a few. You just referred to a $20,000 gap. We just took evidence from Dr. Mortimer, who talked about the Kona. It was a $32,000 gap, and in other vehicles I've seen the gap is even more significant. Yes. So I don't know if we have real clarity about what the gap is. It seems to be quite different from vehicle to vehicle. Is that fair?
Look, it does, and as you go up the scale in terms of as you move towards the luxury brands, yep, that differential becomes greater. That being said, the particular bill that's in that we're talking about here sits under the LCT level. So I think generally, the type of vehicles that we're looking at, and particularly from a salary packaging perspective, but even from a fleet perspective, they're not the luxury vehicles. So I think that $20,000, I mean, look, it's a pretty easy exercise to undertake to compare the available vehicles in the market. But our modelling says that, again, I'll pick the Hyundai, an i30 type of vehicle, that this bill will bring that vehicle, that BEV vehicle, in line with its fossil fuel cousin, and for some vehicles it will actually put money back into the pockets of individuals.
So it's definitely a step in the right direction. Can I thank you for your submission, which is very helpful and very detailed.
Thank you.
I have many more questions than time will allow, but if I could ask you to expand a little more on the ATO matter that I've asked the previous witness to respond to your submission, with regard to the description of car expenses. Do I just want to put that on the public record today, because I think that's very important.
Greg, did you want to talk to Shane? Talk to
Proposal 2.
So, in essence, the way the FBT regime works is it provides an exemption for car expenses associated with car fringe benefits through Section 53. And car expense has a very statutorily defined meaning, which in our view is not broad enough to capture some of the ancillary costs associated with EVs. I mean,
the current language and descriptors that we're talking about meet ICE vehicles, but not the new vehicles, whether they're hybrid or totally exclusively electric battery.
That's exactly right. And the in-home charging is the obvious example. The term uses in respect of fuel. You could argue electricity is fuel. What is in respect of? How far do you stretch that term? And in the absence of legislation, you are going to be reliant on the tax office taking a prudent meaning to the term that aligns to, what we think it should be. But, why stop there when we can clarify it and consider the scope of what we're trying to achieve here and actually implement that through law?
Thank you. With Proposal 3, you talk about second-hand acquisitions, and it concerned me a little earlier that we heard about the possible import of second-hand vehicles, because I know there's been considerable problems in the market with the import of second-hand vehicles from different jurisdictions that have different requirements and are driven differently. I want to make sure that we don't end up with a second-hand market that doesn't help us out with our emission problem and causes more problems. But in your Proposal 3, you're referring to second-hand acquisitions in a slightly different way rather than a second-hand market from overseas. You're talking about moving these through. So can you expand on what your suggestion is there?
I'll let Greg or Shane talk about it, but first of all, I think from the association's perspective, we wouldn't support a loosening of the motor vehicle standards. The Motor Vehicle Standards Act, which was considered several years ago about bringing in parallel imports.
Yes.
We think that would be a demonstrably poor move for the country.
And you've had discussions with the AADA and the MTA about that?
Yep.
And so one voice, you're all clear on that one?
Yep.
Great.
I think the point I would make is in terms of the circulation and recirculation of electric vehicles, the bill's very precise about the value of the vehicle at the first time it was acquired. So if you've got vehicles that are over the limit, but then say 3-4 years down the track in a typical lease scenario, someone wants to move to another vehicle, you're not encouraging the market value of that vehicle then is depreciated. You're not encouraging secondary buyers to take that through the application of assistance with the exemption. So you are limiting the pool of people who can afford that vehicle to the upper end. So I just think it's an area where the bill could be expanded and would aid the circulation of electric vehicles and the take-up of new electric vehicles through easier disposal of the existing electric vehicles that are held by those individuals.
Thank you. I've got two more questions if I can, Chair. One is your proposal about harmonisation. I guess I'm asking this question, and thank you for your commentary in your submission, but and you've alluded to perhaps in your earlier responses, what would be the benefits of a more coordinated national approach to EVs, and what role can the National Electric Vehicle Strategy play in coordinating efforts across government, industry, unions and consumer groups in ways that more effectively put us in the game and get us moving, because we've had 9 years of nothing?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And I think that what's paramount here is the message that it sends to OEMs globally about the provision. I mean, we're a right-hand drive market, we're a small market, so we need to do everything I think we possibly can and practically can in order to encourage manufacturers globally to provide the right vehicles, to provide the sufficient volume of vehicles and the right vehicles in terms of...
Well, one of the submitters said that is a point that's often made, but that the right-hand drive market is still very substantial, even though it's not as big as the left-hand market?
No, although we are, as Australia, a small market in comparison. But and we talked about education and awareness. So that's where we see the harmonisation about a consistent approach, whether it's about incentives. We talked about things about home charging. So we want consistent treatment there. We need consistency around the tax legislation. Consistency around infrastructure. At the moment, we're seeing different states, which is great, but they're doing different things.
Yep.
So we want to see that speed, of a consistency of
speed. So we're
speed.
seeing innovation because people have got frustrated waiting for the federal government to take a stand. As we move forward, though, if we have this level of innovation and capacity building at a state level, what does that do to your capacity to deliver, to get the outcomes that we want nationally?
Well, I think that in terms of, it certainly helps, we service employers across the country, and Senator, what it does for them, it helps them give a very clear understanding of what they're able to do. I think it better incentivises them. we see a number of employers with around their sustainability and ESG strategies. At the moment, it's difficult for them to fully embrace when they've got a patchwork approach.
Yep,
amongst
and they've
the
got
states.
different stuff to implement because they're operating in different states across
Yep.
the same country. Yep.
And they might be a global organisation
Yep.
As well. So for them, the Australian market at the moment is very fragmented in terms of our policy approach.
Yep.
There's some fantastic initiatives which are occurring at a territory and a state level, but we think, particularly in terms of the employers across Australia, who are the largest single procurement body of cars in Australia,
Yep.
that by having that consistency, we'll send the message to them and provide them with the level of certainty as well that they need in terms of order to invest in their
So a bit of
fleets.
ubiquity to enable more stability and more productivity and better
Yep.
economic gains and better environment.
Yes,
Win, 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 win.
The population would be better educated in terms
So
of...
can I just ask my last question? I had a great game of pool in the front bar at Cobar not so long ago during the last campaign because the duty seat of Parks is one of my seats. I met some people out there who put up sheds. They're a small business. There's been a little bit of talk about tradies, small businesses, who's in, who's out. What's in this bill, or what needs to be in this bill to make sure that it's not just big businesses, but those small businesses that are the lifeblood of regional and rural Australia get access and are supported in what they need to do? And you've talked about tool for trade type vehicles as well. So can you just put the picture together for me there? Because I don't want those Australians to be left behind.
Absolutely not. There's probably two parts to that answer. So one is maybe just clarification that there's nothing in the bill that necessarily, well, certainly doesn't preclude small business. So there is often a perception that these kind of services are only available, or opportunities are only available to big business and government sector and people like that. While yes, our companies, our members here, we do focus on, I guess, medium-sized businesses and above.
Yep.
There are several small businesses that will offer their staff a novated lease, and there's the major banks as well. They'll offer products on a retail basis where people can, you can go online and get a novated lease. Right?
So
And
a
there's
sole trader or a small mum and dad partnership who are running a shed business in Cobar, they can access this as it's currently constructed.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Right, so no impediment there whatsoever. I think the broader question though is how do they become aware that that availability is there? So, and that's not necessarily something that the bill itself can answer, but that awareness is certainly a large gap. That those opportunities are out there. That we've talked earlier about the application of this bill, and that there might have been a focus that the application was really just around novated leases. It's not. It's significantly broader than that, and can be broader than that again, as well. But that education piece, I think, would be key in answering in that. I don't actually have the answer for you, though, in terms of what is the best way to get that message out there. But certainly, I think this is a fantastic step in the right direction.
Well,
It
just getting
doesn't
your
preclude
evidence on the record is really important because, small business is critical, and that's where the jobs are, and great small businesses pay proper wages and they don't steal from the people that they live in community with, and so small businesses are critical. It's really important, I think, to make sure that they understand this is a piece of legislation for them as they try to care about their environment and make a transition, whether it's in dedicated EVs or, plug-in hybrids.
Thank you, Senator O'Neill.
Mr. Kent's got one comment, I think.
Just one really quick point. Fringe benefits tax is an employment tax, so small business are employers as well, so they're entitled to it. There are businesses that aren't set up as an employment relationship that will be able to access the concession. So just clarifying that point. So an independent contractor, for example,
would not be eligible. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator O'Neill, and thank you very much to NALSPA and your colleagues who've joined us today. We have gone shamefully over time due to your really interesting evidence. But thank you for appearing as witnesses for us today, and you go with our thanks. Thank you. And I understand as these witnesses are leaving the bench that our next witnesses are ready to go online, and we welcome representatives from the Motor Trades Association of Australia appearing in person from Canberra. Also appearing are representatives from the Australian Automotive Aftermarket Association and the Australian Automotive Dealer Association, who are joining us today via video conference. I understand that information on parliamentary privilege and the protection of witnesses giving evidence to Senate committees has been provided to you. For the Hansard record, could those of you who are in Canberra please state your full names and the capacities in which you appeared today?
Thank you, Chair. Richard Dudley, Chief Executive Officer of the Motor Trades Association of Australia.
Thank you. And could those of you who are appearing online please state your names and the capacity that you're appearing today? In any order.
Thanks, Senator. My name's Stuart Charity. I'm the CEO of the Australian Automotive Aftermarket Association.
Ms Yates, you're on.
I'm the Director of Government Relations and Advocacy for the Australian Automotive Aftermarket Association. I'm Leslie Yates.
And James Vortman, CEO of the Australian Automotive Dealer Association.
Great, thank you very much. I'm not sure how you've organised yourselves in terms of making an opening statement, but perhaps starting with Mr Dudley, if you have an opening statement, would you like to give it? Do you have an opening statement, Mr Dudley?
Through you, Chair, I think for the benefit of the committee, we'll relinquish our opportunity for an opening statement and get into the questions. Thank you.
Okay, that would be greatly of assistance to us. So thank you very much. And I will go to Senator Smith.
Thanks very much. I just want to get the views of the panel in regards to how much of an impediment lack of current access is to charging infrastructure in terms of the willingness of people to take up the initiative. Who'd like to start?
I'm happy to, Senator, if you like. Look, I think it still is an impediment, but I think it's a concern that we are seeing being dispelled by research and education by the industry. You are now available to access chargers in public settings. They're increasingly available, and they're also home charging solutions. And I think as people learn that they don't typically always drive the distances that they think they do, I think their concerns around the charging question are being slightly assuaged.
I think Senator Smith, Richard Dudley, Motor Trades Association, I think this committee's already heard this morning, has seen in the submissions provided already that this is a journey that we have to take all Australians on, that there is now qualified research and analysis that's been undertaken about the importance of home charging, for example. I believe Deloitte, I need to check on this, but Deloitte has recently done some consumer work in this space, where approximately 65% of Australians, if not higher, are looking at the home option as opposed to public charging. So I think the government's plans to actually do a national electric vehicle strategy are critically important so that we can bring these parts of the jigsaw together, and that can be planned and transitioned at the same time.
So two things, including the charging infrastructure in the concession would be a positive step?
Yes, I noted the previous parties to the committee and their commentary surrounding a tax office examination of those sorts of issues. MTAA would also welcome that examination. It should not be ruled out about the home-based infrastructure that may be necessary, and indeed in most cases will be necessary to accommodate the transition across to electric vehicles.
If I could just add something in there, it's Stuart Charity from the Australian Automotive Aftermarket Association. Certainly there's research that we've seen that the strong overwhelming preference of people buying electric vehicles is to have home charging infrastructure, so we would certainly support that being part of the bill if that was an option. We've done a bit of research internationally as well, and particularly around Norway, and certainly access to public charging infrastructure is an issue there. Given their high uptake, there's just not enough availability of public charging infrastructure to satisfy demand. So I think we could do it better in Australia, supporting home infrastructure as well as public infrastructure.
Has anyone been able to quantify or seen any quantification of what this particular tax initiative will deliver in terms of numbers of vehicles that get taken up?
From MTAA's perspective, the answer to that, Senator, is no.
No?
Similarly, we've tried to look at the modelling, and the cost to the budget, and I think those costings seem like it'll be thousands to start with, and graduating up. I think it's a cost of 20 million to the budget in the first year, rising to about 90 across the forward estimates. So it's difficult to know how many vehicles, given that each of those vehicles will attract a different rate of FBT.
Are there any other comments from any other witnesses?
We don't have any visibility on that. I guess the only thing that we'd say, and one of the things that we want to emphasise today, is that the decision to buy an EV is a mixture of a whole lot of different factors. Obviously, ticket price is one, and lowering that and providing a lower cost of purchase is certainly encouraged, but there are a whole lot of other considerations, particularly around the ownership experience that I think factor into purchase decisions.
In the proper, sorry, was there another comment or no? So the legislation proposes a 3-year review mechanism. It was suggested in earlier evidence today that an annual review mechanism might actually be more effective to be able to sort of monitor the take-up. Do you have a view about how the review mechanism should work, and what does the measure of success look like?
Just think if my colleagues want to go first.
You go, Richard.
Measures of success will be hard to determine. I think, as my colleague from the Aftermarket Association said, there are many factors that are going to influence the buying decision of a consumer in this country. The price point will be one. The availability of model selection for that price point will be another. And then you start to look at the incentives and the subsidies that might be available in the jurisdiction that they are living in. That will be a factor as well. Then you'll have the Commonwealth overlay on top of that. And then there will be their personal circumstances. Are they already able to access a vehicle through a leasing arrangement through their employer? Are they able to access the type of vehicle that they want through that particular system? So, as you can see, Senator, there are many different moving parts to the decision-making process of a consumer. The transition plan will go to, we hope, looking at some of those issues so that they're not treated in isolation, because what fits somebody here in Canberra versus somebody in metropolitan Melbourne versus somebody west of Burke in New South Wales will be entirely different. And the impact of their location and their geography on that buying decision will be entirely different as well.
Are there any other comments anyone would like to make in response? Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Senator Smith. I'll go to Senator Rice.
Thanks, Chair. And thank you, everyone, for your submissions and your evidence this morning. I've just got a couple of questions, starting with the Aftermarket Association. And hello, Mr. Charity and Ms. Yates. Good to see you again. Just from your knowledge of the market, what proportion of new cars on the road come into the fleet as a result of fleets supplied by employers?
Lee, do you want to take that one?
Look, we know that fleet purchases are, I listened to the numbers, Senator, from the NALSPA in relation to the volume of fleets. We're somewhat living in a disrupted market because of the wait lists at the moment, so we don't have a very good image and a good line of sight. In terms of the new vehicles coming into the aftermarket, as you know, the vast majority of them come in at 4 years, but we also see a number of younger vehicles coming into the aftermarket from fleets because we service 50% of the fleet market. So annual maintenance of the fleet is 50% aftermarket and tyre replacement is 80% aftermarket. So hence our interest in this particular policy initiative, because we're going to see a number of those vehicles come into independent workshops. Now, as to the deliberate numbers, I can't put my finger on those. I mean, we know what they are as a proportion of sales. It varies enormously amongst our banner groups. So we know that our larger automotive chains are already seeing fleet EVs and hybrids in particular, and in quite reasonable numbers, enough for them to start stocking up on chargers and dedicated EV servicing bays.
Okay, so you're already noticing that, so you expect this will make a significant difference in the number of EVs in the aftermarket? Yeah.
Definitely. Sorry, the other positive of this is because it is targeted at fleets and business owners that run vehicles. It'll mean that more vehicles in the system at this price point will mean that they'll turn those vehicles over, and then that provides a lower entry point for people buying second-hand vehicles as well. So we think that's a positive as well.
Now, you've got particular insight into the aftermarket and how long vehicles are on the road. Do you, given that I think you agree with what seems to be the objective of overall of this bill and others of decarbonisation, do you have a view of the inclusion of the plug-in hybrids in addition to zero carbon battery electric vehicles, given that decarbonisation is the intent, given that we know what the age of vehicles is on the Australian roads, it's of up to 20 years or more potentially if we are subsidising plug-in hybrid vehicles now. Is that something that the aftermarket's concerned about? If you share the aim of decarbonisation of our vehicle fleet?
Leslie, I'd like you to go at that one again.
Look, we see a consumer interest in hybrids in particular. I mean, we'll service any fuel that the consumer brings the car in. I mean, our view as an industry is that we embrace new technology. We're looking forward to the opportunities that EV vehicles bring to the aftermarket and to the automotive industry more broadly. We know that EVs will require less servicing. As to how much is still a moot point. EVs still need to be serviced. We still play a very important role in supporting that lifetime of ownership with electric vehicles. We do see some in our industry showing a preference or an interest in servicing that hybrid niche, because consumers like to run hybrids. It feeds into or answers some of their concern about charging anxiety. There is certainly a debate within the aftermarket about which of those is the greatest contributor to our emissions if we take whole of life vehicle. But look, we are geared up to service, and we will be geared up to service ICE, hybrid and BEVs, and that's the challenge that we have as an industry, is to get ready for all of those, and also to be able to give consumers some good advice about which technology is going to suit their particular need. It's often one of the first people you might ask for advice for is your independent automotive technician. Often we're the first conversation about, should I buy an electric vehicle? So we're also gearing up to be able to give that sort of advice to owners based on what we know about their own circumstances.
Just to add to that, Senator, one of the things that we've seen internationally, particularly around in Norway, which is obviously the highest uptake of EVs and hybrids, there is still a bit of hesitancy to jump straight into a full battery electric EV. So what we saw in Norway is people kind of taking a half step and going to hybrid, and then hybrid sales really falling away to full battery electric. So it's kind of hybrid is as almost a bridging technology for people that are a little bit hesitant. They can have a bet each way, if you like, before they go straight into a full electric.
What's your expectation for the lifetime of those, a plug-in hybrid that's being sold now? How long will that stay on the Australian roads for?
Look, I think from a durability perspective, I mean, we've still got Priuses out there, and in fact, one of our members is doing a recycling program to be able to restore Prius batteries that have cells that aren't working to replace those cells, so that the battery can be recycled with a warranty, so that extends the life of the vehicle. Because obviously, one of the issues around electric vehicles is the sheer cost and difficulty of replacement batteries, and we probably don't know enough yet about the longevity of the life of a full battery electric vehicle. So that's going to impact on how long those vehicles stay in the fleet. The simple fact is the technology is still so new that we probably don't have enough on the road to globally to understand that, and battery technology is improving all the time. So but definitely, if electric vehicles batteries are only lasting 8 to 10 years, and the cost of replacing them is prohibitive at that stage, then that is going to have an impact on how long we see those vehicles on the road.
I'm particularly interested in the hybrid ones, which are also using petrol and diesel and having carbon emissions. And I mean, you would expect that there's no reason why they would be on the road for a lesser period of time than our current averages, which is 10, 15, 20 years, isn't it?
Yeah, certainly the hybrids that we've seen that have been on the roads for long periods of time, there's no differential between those and ICE vehicles.
Okay. I've just got one question to the Motor Trades Association, where your submission says this is a good quick win policy, but doesn't contain the bold thinking needing to shift to sustainable transport and reducing our emissions to zero. So I'm just interested if you could quickly outline what do you see is the key things that are needed in terms of this big picture reform if we're going to have pollution-free transport.
Thank you very much, Senator Rice. Good to see you again. I think you just touched on one of the many issues that need to be considered in terms of the market. Like our colleagues in other organisations, peak industry associations, we've been talking at length with our kindred organisation in Norway to get a handle on exactly what the experiences have been over the last decade in that space. It is quite clear that hybrids and PHEVs are going to have to be considered to be part of the mix and an essential part of the transition. And that has to take into account, as I mentioned earlier, the idiosyncrasies of our population, our geography, the wide dispersal of that population, the nature of the roads, all those sorts of issues. So that's critical. Also critical is to make sure that we've got the workforce that's going to need to transition to those and the workshops. For example, what we have found out of Norway, which is the best indicator at this stage, is that the tooling cost for a workshop transitioning to cater for an electric fleet, and that includes to a lesser extent hybrid vehicles, is around €50,000 or 77,000 Australian dollars. There's about 10 days of additional training for an EV technician above and beyond the core competency requirements for the qualifications as they exist now. And those sorts of workforce issues and making sure that we take communities along the pathway is critical as well. If we don't include the workforce analysis, if we don't include the opportunities for new professions, for example, that EV transition will provide, if we don't include some of the very pertinent questions that you're asking our colleagues in the aftermarket, and those are included in the National EV Strategy, or at least recognise that more work has to be done and done quickly, that way we'll be in a much better position to actually harvest the intended outcomes from all of this, as opposed to unintended consequences that we then have to back roll on policy and regulations.
Thank you. Just a side question. Have you, given that focus on the need for the skills, have you been invited to the Jobs and Skills Summit next week?
No, we haven't, but then again, our list is probably quite specific as well. We'd welcome an opportunity to be there, but we know that there's going to be other opportunities over the coming months as we face these issues. Automotive as a workforce provides a wonderful testing and pilot ground, if you like. There are things that we can do in this space, and one of those indications is how we are looking more broadly at how the industry clusters and those sorts of things will go forward. I believe that the jobs and skills, to give you an indication how important we're finding this, all of my state and territory member colleagues will be talking face-to-face with our Norwegian counterparts and other European counterparts as early as next week. And that follows on from 12 months of over-the-air communications, if you like.
Terrific. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Senator Rice. Senator O'Neill.
Thank you very much, and I'm really pleased we're going to get to some of the really practical, burning questions about how this is going to be implemented. We took evidence earlier today from Dr. Mortimer, who's an academic, and she indicated there were 488 cars, electric vehicles, that were purchased in the year 2020. We heard from the novated lease representatives that there's roughly 18 million cars, I believe, on the road in Australia. There's a massive gap between what's happening in 2020 and where we need to get to. Can I ask each of you to just give me a bit of an indication of how critical you believe it is to get harmonisation nationally into this space? Perhaps we start with you, Mr. Dudley.
Thank you very much, Senator O'Neill. Critical. It's why all of us came together at the end of last month. We recognise that we are an industry in this country that has peculiarities which are not found in the automotive industry in other parts of the world, but there are great similarities as well. But we also know that on such a critical issue of transitioning the Australian fleet of around 20 million vehicles, commercial, light commercial, passenger, it depends on how you want to cut that cake. It's absolutely critical that the industry itself answers questions where it can in a unified way, is to provide clarity so that we can not protect, as some are suggesting, the industry as it exists today, but to get to the end state that we all want to get to by having a unified position on a whole stack of the critical issues that we have been covering and that the committee has heard. One of those involved all of the industry coming together to actually, even though it might sound strange, to agree on what some might think are some fairly fundamental questions. And we have reached agreement and are unified on some of those fundamental questions, including the workforce, including the infrastructure, both home and public, that needs to run parallel to that. The fact that the transition of the existing fleet from internal combustion engines to electric must be done in cohort with the ambitious targets that we've got to reach carbon emission reductions, etc., and then to decarbonise the fleet eventually. But we have to do this in a way that recognises the idiosyncrasies of Australia, its vast landmass, and the different players in it and their different needs. Now, if we can do that as part of the announcements that the Minister for Climate Change and the Minister for Infrastructure brilliantly raised over the last couple of weeks, we look forward with tremendous anticipation to the discussion paper that's due to come out next month, and we can go to some of those very specific issues. It's not beyond the industry, and it's not beyond the people, the almost 70,000 businesses and the 370,000 plus people who currently keep Australians mobile in this country, to understand how we're going to do the transition and what's involved.
So the tension there between harmonisation and differentiation, I think, is something we need to tease out a little. So the harmonisation makes everything much more efficient, but the differentiation is a sign of innovation. How difficult is it to operate businesses across the country where there is a different set of rules and regulations and incentives operating, say, in the context of the ACT as opposed to Western Australia?
Oh, it's enormously difficult, particularly for our national chains. So where we have banner groups that have 300 or 400 outlets and workshops across Australia, that means in some instances different training as well, Senator, because Western Australia and New South Wales have licensing arrangements for automotive service and repair. And each of the states, not quite yet there, but each of them are having conversations about what the qualifications are required for servicing electric vehicles. So when you start to introduce that layer of complexity, so you're trying to roll out a national training plan for highly qualified automotive technicians, particularly in our industry where you go through your apprenticeship and then add-on training is something that the master technicians do, but the great bulk of them may not have forward-facing new technology opportunities. So you have to roll out a program that suits particular states and is different from, say, Queensland to Western Australia. That adds a whole lot of complexity, and we'd like to see national EV qualifications. And we know that many of our technicians are already lining up for those. In fact, our TAFEs are reporting huge waiting lists for the EV unit. We spoke to a TAFE provider here in Victoria. We've got 250 technicians on their wait list. So those EV units are full. We want to be able to see technicians move between states. We have a skill shortage. If someone moves states, we certainly want another workshop to pick up one of these technicians. So state by state regulations changing adds a lot of cost to business, and it makes consumers very nervous.
Through you, Chair.
Yes,
Mr. Vortman.
On your point of differentiation versus consistency, I think there are areas here where differentiation or competitive federalism is appropriate, such as the incentives that some of the state governments have started providing. But there are other areas where, it's completely inappropriate, such as a road user charge. We've seen the Victorian government implement a road user charge, whereas other governments haven't. We've seen others announce a start date of 2027. So we've got this particular, potential situation where a motorist is driving in one state and then will have to potentially, change the usage meter or whatever it is in another state. We really do need a harmonised system for something like a road user charge. But then we go to the extreme end of the spectrum with the ACT, one of our smallest jurisdictions, banning internal combustion engine vehicles. And, to us, it's not clear how a territory government will be able to enforce that. Vehicle importation policy is clearly something which is the domain of the federal government. And I know that we're already looking at all the examples how you could possibly register a vehicle in New South Wales. You could, sort of leave it at your coast house. All of these potential ways to subvert the ban are what makes our members sit back and think, how is this going to work? And why we really need a national approach on some of these things.
Okay. So
and that's why we all as an industry here welcome the announcement of a national electric vehicle strategy.
Fantastic. So I didn't receive a submission from the AAAA, but your presence here and your comments indicate that you are in support and you're all in unison on that in the evidence you've given me so far. One of the things I'm keen to get from you is, and perhaps Mr. Vortman might be the most appropriate person here, a sense of the distribution of sales of EVs. We've got a sense of the numbers. Where are EVs being sold?
Yeah, look, that's a great question, and we don't have specific data on where they are, but they are increasingly in our urban areas, less in regional Australia. It must be said, in this early stage of adoption, we're seeing a vehicle like the Tesla being the best-selling electric vehicle in Australia, and a lot of those are in the more affluent sort of neighbourhoods of Australia, your inner city, sort of leafy kind of suburbs. That's where we're seeing many of these initial sales in this period.
Okay, so we haven't
Leslie, we've got, do we have registration data for EVs?
Yeah, we collect data on postcode data for all makes and models. And our EV data it's 2021 data, so it's got a bit of a time lag. But there's no doubt that the EV sales or the EV postcodes are very inner urban centric. Some as you get further away from the city, the sales and the presence of EV decreases.
And there are probably a range of reasons that inform that reality. But if you could provide any of that data to the committee, I think that's important. Because one of the things I've been asking, and I think Mr Dudley referred to it in his comments there, is how important is it that we have hybrid in the mix? Because there have been some submissions that saying, no, we should just go straight to battery electric vehicles only, getting a positive tax treatment. I think we need to see what's going on the ground, and it's pretty clear from what you've just said then that there is a concentration in the inner cities, urban areas. It's not in regional rural Australia, because people are making they're making an investment decision not to invest in those jurisdictions and those places. Okay, so that's
Senator,
clear.
to your point on hybrids, if I may, the question is, for a vehicle like the Mitsubishi Outlander, there are not many pure electric SUVs that are affordable at the moment. Now, what the Outlander gives you is it gives you a vehicle that is relatively affordable. And the question is, if you're not incentivizing that, will the purchaser just buy a petrol vehicle? That is the question that we have to ask. The hybrid vehicles and Mitsubishi have put in a very helpful submission to this process, which shows that most of the motorists do use the electric component of that vehicle to drive around. And why wouldn't they with the current fuel prices? So I think there is a very important role for those plug-in hybrids to play. We're seeing sales of those vehicles in the US really increase at the moment. And I think as others have mentioned, this is a bridging technology, and we are way behind a lot of the world. And this is a technology that will help consumers become comfortable before they take that next step into a pure electric vehicle.
There seems to be some contested evidence about how much those hybrid plug-in vehicles are actually using the battery as opposed to using older fuel technologies. So if you have any insights into that that are practical from Australia's context now rather than historical, that would be also very, very interesting for us to get. You've mentioned workforce arrangements and I guess just anticipating the future that we will hit some targets and we will get a change here. You've got pent-up demand in terms of people wanting to train for EVs. I just want to take an opportunity to ask how many women are starting to train for the burgeoning EV market, because it would be a cleaner job in some ways, and it's a stable job with a good pay. How's that going?
Yeah, I totally agree. I think this is a wonderful opportunity for us to be absolutely promoting our industry as a great opportunity for women to enter the workforce. Our industry is acutely aware that our percentages of women are low, that we have a labour shortage, and that effectively we've only been talking to 50% of the population. We are seeing women entering the profession in greater numbers, and there is some anecdotal evidence that they are embracing the new technology elements. We've recently completed a survey, and women show a particular interest in new technology as being a great opportunity for being in this industry, and they also show a higher level of I want to stay in this industry for a long period of time than their male counterparts. So once they come in, they show optimism about the future of the industry in greater numbers than men, and they also show a greater sense of staying within this industry for a longer period of time. Okay. So I think that's a great challenge for us, and one that we're absolutely up to embracing.
So through you, Chair, we have specific women in automotive activities happening in each of the states and territories through the MTAA member association, so they are a target group quite specifically for some of the reasons my colleague in the Quad A has just mentioned, but also because we are hitting at the moment a 38,700 strong shortage of skilled professionals across the automotive streams as we speak. It's the highest on record. It's not based on job vacancy data because most of our or businesses left advertising for these sorts of jobs a long time ago. They tend now to actually try and attract their workers from other businesses down the street, across the road, around the community. And so that's critical. And a critical cohort is to explore how we can actually get all sorts of those people back re-engaged or re-engaged for the first time. And as Leslie just said, there are specific attributes which this is attracting all sorts of different people, including mature age people who wish to come and try automotive as opposed to what they may have been doing throughout most of their other career. And we should be encouraging that as part of a multifaceted approach to looking at addressing the skill shortages in the first instance, but also preparing to have the workforce that we need going forward.
Yeah, well, it's a transformational moment for which this piece of legislation is a sort of a signal. Let's get on with the job. One of the submissions from the FCAI indicated support for this bill, but I noticed there was media recently about some uncertainty about the motivation for what they've been putting on the public record with regard to electric vehicles. Do you have any comment about that? Because I've got concerns about the FCAI with regard to the potential for bringing in second-hand vehicles, which could be very problematic for us, given that we're in a supply crisis moment. I'm also interested in the Deloitte report that I have here, which places, it says here on the final page, government fleet supporting OEM imports, and I don't know that it indicates OEM imports into car dealerships, which provides the education, delivery, ongoing maintenance, and return and sale of the vehicle, which is going to be important. So I'll just open up that discussion for comment from those who'd like to put something on the record. What do we need to be careful of with this legislation in terms of next steps, our interactions with OEMs, and maintaining, I think, you said 300,000 jobs in the industry, Mr Dudley?
Around 370,000.
And I think, is it 60,000 in the dealer network alone?
Not 60,000.
So, Mr Vortman, you want to kick us off?
Yeah, and just on the comment around the used car imports, I think a lot of people are going to use this electric vehicle transition to try and reignite that debate that we need to bring in used car imports into Australia. And I note that there were some submissions which asked this committee to consider extending the FBT concessions to used vehicles. And all I'd say on that is, we're not opposed to it, but let's look at which used vehicles these are. If these are used vehicles that have come into Australia without a type approval, in other words, without the blessing of a manufacturer and its dealer network, we need to think very hard about if those are the type of vehicles we want to provide tax concessions to. So that's all I'll say on the used vehicle thing. I think, we can all agree that...
So we're saying used vehicles that came into Australia new, that are recycled then as used vehicles, there's no risk there. Used vehicles that come in from another context, there's risk there that we should avoid, and they should not be eligible for the FBT.
Yeah, if it was first registered as a new vehicle in Australia, then that's fine.
Okay.
But even so, I mean, there are questions around: is it appropriate to provide these concessions to a 12-year-old vehicle, for instance, and so forth? I'll just make those points. In terms of what's currently happening is the previous government did open up the import policy to allow certain electric vehicles to come into the country. We're quite keen to see some of the data on how many of these are coming in, because we're not necessarily sure that it's a good thing. These vehicles often, may be subject to recalls that we don't know about, that don't enjoy the Australian consumer law protections that vehicles that were brought in through traditional channels do. And it's something we will always be urging the government to take a very close look at.
Okay.
And through you, Chair, to be quite clear, MTAA said and chose its words quite carefully in exploring the potential or examining the potential of used vehicles. Those are used vehicles which have already met Australian design rule components, were imported as part of an OEM's offering to this market, not for parallel imports, for the reasons
okay, so that's very clear and now on the record. Yep. Do you have any further comments that you really want to make about the detail of the legislation? We've certainly had some quite detailed submissions about ATO implications. What does it mean to actually, charge your car at home? Is that going to be a cost? What sort of rebate should people get if they are using the electricity from their home to recharge their car for work? We've had some detail around that, but I'm interested if you have any further comments based on the submissions you've read.
Through you, Chair, I think a couple of previous witnesses before the committee have made mention of this. It is the bill before you is based on the existing status of the FBT rulings. What we're transitioning to is an entirely different environment, if you can look at it that way. It's a different workforce. It's a different. It's like moving from horse and cart to automobiles. We're now changing the propulsion system from automobiles to a different propulsion system. It brings with it a whole lot of risks, potential unintended consequences, but also tremendous opportunities, not the least of which is obviously decarbonising the fleet and achieving the ambitions that we all wish to achieve in terms of fixing our climate change problem. But the problem with the actual, that's why we called it a temporary quick fix, because it's based on the existing legislation. And whilst that's welcomed, we can't lose sight of the fact that this myriad of issues, including tax reform, including workforce, including harmonising, and if it's not federally led, then it must be nationally consistent.
And work health and safety.
Those are the sorts of issues that must be considered as part of an overarching strategic plan. Not something that's going to be fixed in this bill, but this bill provides the catalyst, if you like, for raising the issues that it's not just about what we can do with existing legislation. It may mean eventually changing that legislation altogether.
Thank you.
If I could build on Mr. Dudley's comments, I think we all agree this is a very good step, but it is only a first step, and the electric vehicle strategy, it's appropriate that we have a strategy, because this is going to be an exercise in change management for so many elements of not only the industry but wider society, and it's so important that we have a federally led approach which brings the states, territories and the industry on board, so that we get this right. We get this right in terms of incentivising the vehicles to come online, but also preparing everyone else who needs to be prepared, such as emergency services, such as building codes, such as every other element that's going to be touched by this.
So what are you referring there to in terms of emergency services and building codes? Why is that a factor that's going to come into play with the increase in the use of electric vehicles?
Well, I think these are just, emergency services, for instance, when you are attending to a crash, there are different procedures for an electric vehicle than there are for an internal combustion engine vehicle. For building codes, for us to be able to retrofit apartment buildings, or ensure that every new building has the capacity to have an electric vehicle charging, that's something that industry is going to have to think of. So those are probably two examples, but there will be others. I think that's why this sort of holistic approach that is a strategy is the way to go.
Yeah, and I'd just like to echo this, that our industry is crying out for national leadership on this issue and a holistic strategy. This policy is a great signal to the market so early in the term of the government that you're taking this seriously, and we look forward to engaging on a comprehensive strategy that's nationally led, because that is the only way we're going to get meaningful change and a huge upswing in EV and other low emission technology vehicles on our roads. It won't happen organically from the industry, and it won't happen if we have a scattergun, fragmented approach. We do need that national leadership, and we need the holistic strategy. And I think we stand as an industry united, ready to work with the government on a strategy that's going to achieve our national objectives.
Fantastic. So thank you very much for you coming in today and for coming in via Zoom to talk with us. Really good to get the sort of flesh out there on the bones of the policy, what it will mean when it gets actually out there on the ground and into the sector. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thanks, Senator.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Senator O'Neill, and thank you very much to the panel, those of you appearing online, and Mr. Dudley appearing in Canberra. That concludes the time that we have for the panel. We thank you very much for appearing as witnesses. For those of you who are online, I'd like to ask that you disconnect from the video conference and you can continue to watch us after lunch through the live stream on the Parliament's website. Thank you again. You go with our thanks, and the committee will now break for lunch and resume at 1:30 p.m.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you.
Okay, I now welcome officials from Treasury joining us via video conference and the Department of Industry, Science and Resources joining us on teleconference. I remind Commonwealth officers appearing today that the Senate has resolved that an officer of the Department of the Commonwealth shall not be asked to give opinions on matters of policy and shall be given reasonable opportunity to refer questions asked of the officer to superior officers or to a minister. This resolution prohibits only questions asking for opinions on matters of policy and does not preclude questions asking for explanations of policies or factual questions about when and how policies were adopted. I also remind officers of the Senate order specifying the process by which a claim of public interest immunity should be raised. A copy of the order is available from the Secretariat. For the Hansard record, starting with Treasury, will you please state your full names and the capacity in which you appear today?
Thanks, Senator. Damien Mullally, Assistant Secretary of the Infrastructure Branch in the Labour Market, Environment, Industry and Infrastructure Division.
Leah Wojcik, Director in the Infrastructure Branch in the Labour Market, Environment, Industry and Infrastructure Division of Treasury.
Dean Fraser, Assistant Secretary in the Personal and Small Business Tax Branch in Revenue Group.
Jeff Garnon, Director in the Small Business Tax Group.
Thank you. And could the DISA representatives please state your full names and the capacity in which you appear?
Donna Looney, Head of Division, Industry Growth Division at the Department of Industry, Science and Resources.
Nicholas Clayton, Manager, Battery Minerals Team, Department of Industry, Science and Resources.
Judith Blake, General Manager, Sector Development Branch in Industry Growth Division.
William Tan, Acting General Manager, National Reconstruction Fund Priorities Branch in Manufacturing Division.
Thank you all for appearing for us today. I assume that none of you have an opening statement and I should proceed to questions. Is that right?
That's correct, Senator, from Treasury.
And correct for Department of Industry, Science and Resources.
Thank you very much. I'll go to Senator Rice.
Thanks, Chair, and thank you all for being with us this afternoon. We've had a submission and evidence from Climate Works that's indicated that new sales of zero-emission electric vehicles need to be at 76% of vehicle sales by 2030 if Australia is going to play its part in keeping global heating below 1.5 degrees. And if we want to keep it under 2 degrees for Australia to play its part, well, then new EV sales need to be at least 50% of new car sales. So how much is either Treasury or DISA forecasting that this legislation will boost new zero-emission electric vehicle sales?
Well, just Leah Wodgick here. I'll just make a comment. It is quite difficult to quantify, given the uptake of electric cars, as you're aware, is constrained in the short term due to existing supply chain issues impacting globally. And there potentially could also be a lag in uptake as individuals wait for existing leasing and car arrangements to end and then progressively move on. So I think the short answer to that is it's difficult to quantify.
And I think I'd add, Senator, that this measure is part of a broader package of reforms which are about encouraging electric vehicle take-up. This element, as well as the removal of the import tariffs, combined form the government's electric car discount. But again, that's part of a broader package. The government has announced that a discussion paper on the national... Sorry, Senator, I just had a interruption from virtual land. So the government's also announced a discussion paper on the National Electric Vehicle Strategy, and there is also the government's announced a Driving the Nation plan, which looks to establish a national charging network and set targets for Commonwealth fleet purchases. And I think it's fair to say that all these policies are complementary and will work together. So it's really hard to isolate the particular impacts purely from this FBT measure.
Okay, so it's a package, and we're going to need all of that package, would you say, if we're going to get to the 50 or 76%, given that electric vehicle sales are currently at 2%?
I think we're coming off a low base, but you know, the government has a suite of measures and signalled the National Electric Vehicle Strategy and announcements on Friday as well. We're really looking forward to sort of consultation on that strategy and seeing where that leads.
Great. Okay. And what's the estimate of the cost of this scheme? That's what we're considering in this legislation.
So the cost of the FBT exemption is estimated to be $205 million over the 4 years to 2025-26.
Okay, and how much of that cost do you expect will go to zero emission electric vehicles, and how much to the plug-in electric hybrids that are also included under the scheme?
We haven't done that level of analysis, Senator.
Do you have any? Okay, have you got any estimates at all, or they're all lumped in together?
Yeah, it's all lumped in together. We've costed the government's policy announcement, which included the plug-in hybrids as well as the electric vehicles. We didn't undertake a separate costing purely on excluding hybrid cars.
Okay. Is there a difference? I mean, there's a difference in cost to electric vehicles compared with the plug-in hybrids. Can you tell me, have you looked at what the average savings are for electric vehicles compared with the average savings for a plug-in hybrid?
The average savings under the FBT exemption?
Yes.
I might ask my colleague, Mr. Garnon, just to sort of talk through a typical Cameo, but I suspect that the savings will be pretty similar for both vehicles. But there are a range of sort of aspects that drive the costs and the cost savings, in particular the actual cost of the electric vehicle itself. But I might ask Mr. Garner just to talk through a general Cameo, if that's okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'll just check you can hear me.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So FBT has two different valuation methods which people choose, and I think they've been referred to earlier in the hearings. The statutory formula is commonly used for a vehicle that is highly private use, and the cost base is otherwise used. Now, the statutory formula works off the cost of the car. There's certain things around the edge that are included in that, but basically it's what you pay for the car. So FBT is based on that cost, and therefore the more the car costs, the more FBT would presumably be. So Whilst I don't think there's been any work done on a splitting out of hybrids and others, what I'm hearing from the industry is that some of the hybrids tend to be the cheaper ones and the pure electric might be more expensive. So you would expect the savings to be skewed towards the pure battery electric, not simply on the basis of the differences in cost between them. Then the saving also, if it's a salary packaged arrangement, the actual tax saving is likely to appear in the individual's income tax because the benefit to them is sacrificing salary. So then you'll have a saving that is variable depending on their personal tax rates.
Yes, I mean, I'm just wondering what went into the estimated, what the estimated cost of this measure over the forwards, that 200 and whatever it was $million. Could you give us, perhaps on notice, a breakdown of what the assumptions are in that costing, and how much of it? Surely exactly what that costing is depends upon what the cost of the vehicles are. And you're right, Mr. Garman. At the moment, at least, electric vehicles are considerably more expensive than the plug-in electric hybrids.
I'm happy to take on notice, Senator, to find out what further information we can provide.
Okay, thank you. And what are your plans for the customs changes that are also flagged here?
Sorry, was that question, what's the status of the customs changes?
Yes.
So it's not part of this bill, but a notice of intention to propose customs tariff alterations 2022 was signed on the 18th of July and published on the 21st of July. This notice effectively removed tariffs on imports of certain electric cars imported with effect from 1 July 2022. The notice of intention was tabled in Parliament on the 2nd of August, and then legislative changes to the Customs Tariff Act will be required within 12 months to confirm the tariff rate changes, and that process will be managed by Australia Border Force. So effectively, it's in hand. The notice has been tabled, and it just needs to be supported by legislative changes completed within the next 12 months.
But the changes are going to come into play, have already come into play, though.
Yeah, they've already come into effect. So,
yeah. So, okay, so we're keeping our fingers crossed that the legislation goes through and you're not in a position of then having to have custom changes that aren't legislated.
There's 12 months to complete those legislative.
Right. And can you give a breakdown of how much that customs change will impact on the cost of both EVs and of hybrids? Okay. Look, there's been concerns from submitters about a review being held in 3 years when we've got leases that are running for longer than that period. Would there be any reason why, if there was a review related and there were changes that were introduced, why existing rights would be removed, why people would have that fear and not grandfathered if there was a future law change?
So the legislation, Senator, is ongoing legislation. The government has signalled that it will undertake a review, but the outcomes that that review will be determined at that point in time. And then if there are any requirements to change legislation, that would follow the normal path. So this legislation gives effect to the FBT changes moving forward, and that's what the law will say. And there will be a review, and that will inform whether or not the government at that point in time wants to look at making changes to the legislation.
But could I just ask you, just in terms of precedent, usually if you had a review and you had measures in place, would they usually be grandfathered?
I wouldn't want to preempt anything, Senator, but I think, traditionally, one of the things that are looked at with any law change would be transitional arrangements. So that would certainly be a consideration if the government was to make any changes to the legislation as a result of this review.
Okay. There was a submission from Professor Miranda Stewart, and that noted that the biggest beneficiaries of this measure will be people on the highest tax rate, above $180,000. Is this a correct assessment?
So in relation to the FBT exemption, the income tax savings would go to, the benefits go to anyone that's salary sacrificing electric vehicle under the scheme, and it would be open to all income earners. So all income earners would be able to take advantage of this concession as long as their employer offered the salary sacrificing arrangements. But because people at a higher marginal tax rate pay a higher marginal tax rate, they would get more benefits under the exemption. Having said that, the exemption is capped to the luxury car tax limit, which in 22-23 is about 84,900. So it doesn't provide any support to vehicles over that amount. So, you know, people buying very expensive Teslas, for example, which you might think could be at their higher income levels, wouldn't get an advantage through this exemption.
Could you, I mean, if you're not willing to say definitively that that's correct at this stage, would you have to take on notice and have a look at her submission and see whether that, her assessment that that's going to be correct, that's correct, is in fact correct?
Happy to take it on notice, Senator.
Okay, thanks. And my final question is about the situation with companies who are converting four-wheel drives to electric vehicles, which there's a lot of work being done there, and certainly the issues that we've been discussing in this committee about the benefits of this to regional areas as well as urban areas. Assuming that those conversions are done on new vehicles, would internal combustion vehicles that are then being converted to zero emission vehicles, would they be eligible for this FBT exemption?
Mr. Garner, I don't know if you've got any insights, otherwise we might take it on notice.
The FBT benefit that is taxed is the use or availability for use of the vehicle. So it extends across the life of the vehicle. If the car provided was had been converted, and noting you said it was new, so I suppose we assume we're across the threshold eligibility, then if it was an electric vehicle when it was being used within the definitions in the Act of Electric Vehicle, then in theory it should get the same treatment as the others.
Okay, that's good to know, because certainly there's been concerns at the moment. We haven't got four-wheel drive or utes, electric utes, and there is those conversions going on of four-wheel drive utes being converted as new vehicles being converted. So to hear that, that's good to know. Thank you. Thanks very much, Chair.
Thank you very much, Senator Rice. I'm not sure if I've got Senator Bragg there, and if I do, I'll go to him, and if I don't, I do have you, Senator Bragg.
I do, but I think Senator Smith's going to kick off.
Okay, Senator Smith.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you very much for officials making themselves available this afternoon. I do have a similar theme of questioning as Senator Rice in regards to the costings that have been provided in the explanatory memorandum and how they vary from the costings that have been provided by the Parliamentary Budget Office. Also some queries in regards to comments from Professor Miranda Stewart's submission and the Treasury's response to those, as well as some questions in regards to the review mechanism. I will start with other questions, and if I don't get to those three substantive matters, we'll put them on notice. Can you explain to me in the detail the consultation process that officials went through in bringing forward this initiative?
Thanks, Senator. So the bill was not subject to public consultation. This is a discrete amendment to the Fringe Benefits Tax Assessment Act to give effect to the government's election commitment to exempt electric cars from FBT from 1 July 2022. While Treasury did not undertake public consultation, we did engage with the ATO as part of our quality assurance processes.
So can you just detail for me the process that you went through in terms of dates and officials that you met with the Australian Taxation Office?
I'll have to take that on notice, Senator, to give you those exact dates.
Why was it... Thank you. If you could take that on notice. Why was it considered not necessary to have a public consultation process on what is a very, very live and live issue with high levels of public interest?
Ultimately, Senator, decisions on whether or not legislation goes out for public consultation is a matter for government.
You'll have to apologise to me. The reception is very, very poor. Are these officials in Canberra?
Yes, Senator.
Okay, well, I'll raise this with the chair, but I think this is a very sort of suboptimal way to conduct a public hearing because the reception is very, very poor. So could you just explain that to me again? Why was it necessary not to have a public consultation process?
So, Senator, what I said was that ultimately, whether or not public consultation is undertaken on legislative drafting is a matter for government.
So the government decided not to have a public consultation process?
Well, Senator, as I said, whether or not legislation is consulted on is a matter for government.
How many times did you consult with the ATO over the initiative?
I'll have to take that on notice, Senator. There was extensive consultation through the process, and we also have a sort of a quality assurance process, but I'm happy to take it on notice to get you those dates.
Thank you very much. Who in the government decided that there was not necessary to have a public consultation process?
I couldn't tell you that, Senator, but I'd be happy to take it on notice. But ultimately, as I said, it's a matter for government if they want to consult on drafting.
I'm just interested to know, was it the Treasury part of government, or was it the Department of Industry, Science and Resources part of government, or was it both?
Again, Senator, I don't want to mislead you. I'm happy to take it on notice. I suspect it will be a joint decision between Treasurer and the Minister.
Themselves?
Or their officers. As I said, I will take it on notice.
Great, thanks very much. What was the rationale for having no sunset provision in the legislation, given the cost over the forward estimates is $205 million?
So the government's policy decision was to make this an ongoing FBT exemption, but as we've spoken to before, there will be a review after 3 years, and that review will give an opportunity for government to consider how the proposal is working and whether or not any changes are required. But it's an ongoing measure.
On the review, what are the metrics that will define whether the measure has been successful or not?
Well, I think it's probably going to be a broad-ranging review that's going to look at a range of aspects. I think one of the key ones will be getting some data around the uptake, the types of vehicles that people are salary sacrificing. As I said, I think it'll be a broad range of review, but we haven't sort of developed detailed terms of reference for that review, but that will be part of the process prior to the commencement after 3 years.
What is the expected take-up on each of the years over the forward estimates in terms of number of new vehicles?
So I think I addressed this question, Senator, as part of my response earlier, but the costing is $205 million over the 4 years, but this is one of a range of reforms that are all aimed at encouraging electric take-up. We talked previously about the removal of the import tariffs. There's the National Electric Vehicle Strategy. There are a whole range of initiatives on the Driving the Nation plan. So we haven't got detailed breakdowns of this specific measure, as all these policies are complementary and work together to improve the uptake of electric vehicles.
So when we think about I
was just going to mention as well, in drawing out the other policies, we've also got state policies as well, so also having an impact on uptake as well.
So you're unable to share with the committee what the expected impact in number of vehicles. You can't share with the committee any details about the uptake and the number of new vehicles that this specific initiative will deliver.
I think I've said previously, Senator, that it's very difficult to identify the impacts of this exemption in isolation, but I did take on notice whether or not we were able to provide any further information.
Great, thank you very much. The Treasury costing for this initiative is $205 million. Can you detail for the committee what are the assumptions that underpin Treasury's costing and whether or not this includes or factors in any behavioural changes?
I think similar to my previous answer, Senator, I will take that on notice.
Are you able to share with us now why there is such a difference between the Treasury's estimate and the estimate provided by the Parliamentary Budget Office? The PBO's 2022 election report estimate quantified the initiative at $360 million over the forward estimates.
So Treasury is not in a position to provide a breakdown of the PBO's costings, Senator, but what I can say is that Treasury's costings is largely consistent. I think the PBO's costing included the tariff component, whereas the $205 million is just for the FBT aspect. But as I said, look, Treasury is not in a position to sort of provide a breakdown of the PBO's costings, and it'd be best to speak directly to the PBO.
So it's the tariff costing that provides the difference between the $205 million and the $360 million? Is that what you're suggesting?
Well, what I'm saying is that the 205 is solely for the FBT exemption, and my understanding, and this is why probably best to speak to the PBO, but the PBO's costing also included the tariff component.
Does the Treasury's costing take into account potential impacts on excise and income tax receipts?
I'll have to take that on notice, Senator.
Thanks very much. Many witnesses and submissions have pointed out that the car industry will phase out internal combustion engines by or from 2035, and Australia has an effective national target of 46% of new car sales to be electric by 2030. Wouldn't you expect that over time the cost of this measure will grow?
And I think that's one aspect of the review in 3 years to determine what the uptake is, the types of vehicles that are being gaining access to the exemption. And after 3 years, I think will inform future policy decisions.
Does the Treasury expect the cost of the measure to increase over the forward estimates period?
I've only got the costing over the forward estimates, Senator.
Has the Treasury done any formal costings or analysis of the medium-term costs of the measure?
Not that I'm aware, Senator.
Okay. Does the Treasury disagree with the PBO's analysis that the cost of this measure is highly sensitive to EV uptake and could fluctuate?
I think, as I said initially, Senator, I'm not in a position to sort of analyse the PBO's costings or assumptions, but be happy to take it on notice if there's any additional information we can provide on our costings.
In some opening remarks by one of the officials, my apologies that I don't recall her name, there was a comment about supply in Australia being constrained. My question is, how long do you expect supply to be constrained?
I'm happy to take that, Senator. So it's very, given the current environment, it's very difficult to predict how long those supply chain implications will eventuate for. I think, we are starting to see some easing of supply chain implications in recent time, but I might hand over to Ms. Wojcik to further answer.
Yeah, no,
Thank you very
Leah
much.
Wojcicki. I was just going to say the same thing, and I think in the recent economic update, yeah, there were some signs of supply chains.
Sorry. This is very, very suboptimal. You're going to have to speak into the microphone if I'm going to be able to hear you clearly.
Terribly sorry about that. This wasn't how we planned to come across. We had some IT difficulties.
It's quite okay. It's quite okay.
I was just going to echo the same. There are some signs of broader supply chain constraints globally starting to ease, but they're still there, and it is a global marketplace. And you know, our consumers' demand and manufacturer supply is calibrated against that global marketplace. And
I'm just trying to understand: is this a short-term supply constraint issue, a medium-term supply constraint issue, or a long-term supply constraint issue?
I think, Senator, we are seeing, I think, given the pandemic, that we're still seeing lags, that it is predominantly a short term, but as we are still operating in very uncertain economic environment, and there is a significant lag between, when between when you see some of the factors that we've discussed, when they will normalise. So there will be, while I do think predominantly the factors are predominantly short term, we could see that they might persist over a medium term as there are some that we see a normalisation in those global trade routes.
What are the 3 or 4 most significant factors constraining supply presently?
I guess we've got a lot of global demand. We've had disruptions in semiconductors and other inputs to manufacturing, and you've got the shipping delays. But as we've said, we've started to see some signs of them potentially. The peak of some of the supply chains, you're starting to see potentially some shipping costs, and that's potentially starting to come down. So it's just, I know that's not probably the best answer. It's just there's a lot going on that's just impacting on supply chains, and we've seen it, throughout a number of sectors as well.
Senator, during the pandemic, what we did see was a significant increase in goods trade, not just in Australia but globally, which put significant pressures on global transport and shipping costs. And as my colleague has indicated, that we are seeing an easing in recent times of those shipping and costs and the implications of containers and transport routes. They are still at significantly elevated levels when you compare to pre-pandemic levels. So, and hence why we think that these supply chains issues are predominantly short term, just given the nature of the global pandemic, that we do see some of these supply chain pressures potentially persist.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. I might defer to Senator Bragg, and then if time allows, I have some additional questions. Yep. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Just quickly, I just wanted to ask you again, it's about the costings, which I know that we've had extensive discussion about this afternoon. One of the things I wanted to ask you about was, what do you think the average cost to revenue will be per vehicle?
I don't have that information, Senator. Happy to take it on notice. I can't answer that at this point in time, but I'll take it on notice, Senator.
Okay. But do you know how many vehicles they're expected to make use of this scheme?
No, so that was sort of the response to the earlier questions. Is one element of a range of reforms, all aimed at encouraging electric vehicle take-up, and it's really hard to identify the impacts of this FBT exemption in isolation. I have undertaken to take that on notice to see what more I can provide, Senator.
Okay. So, what have you given any thought of? Have you costed have you read the submissions to the inquiry from industry?
We've reviewed some of the submissions, yes, Senator.
Yeah. So have you seen that a number of them have suggested that there should be an inclusion of charging infrastructure?
I understand that some submissions have called for that, yes, Senator.
Yeah. Have you costed that?
That hasn't been costed, no, because it wasn't part of the policy announcement, Senator.
Okay. Well, if you could take that question on notice about the average cost to revenue per vehicle, I think that would be good. And also, I was wondering whether or not if you costed this over 1 and 4 years, the policy?
It's costed over the forward estimates.
So 4 years?
Yes, yeah.
And that's it. And that you haven't done anything beyond that, as per Senator Smith's inquiry?
Not to my knowledge, but I took that on notice, Senator.
Okay. I'll finish now, but I just probably make the point that I don't know that. I'm a little bit surprised that you don't know some of these answers, and you've taken all this on notice. I would have thought the average cost per vehicle would be something that you would know, but I understand you've probably got a lot on your plate. So actually, I think Senator Smith might have a couple more questions. So
I'll just allocate the call. Thanks, Senator Bragg, and I'll just ask just a couple of follow-up questions along similar lines in relation to so for Treasury, in relation to the 3-year review of the bill. We have had some witnesses, as has been explained by the other senators, saying that the review itself creates some uncertainty for businesses who are looking to take advantage of the exemption. You've commented that the legislation will be ongoing and that this is a sort of a normal review process, and you've sort of referenced the possibility at a later date of transition type arrangements. What advice would you have for people who are looking to investigate this FBT exemption and utilise it, about the level of certainty that they should have about the measure?
Oh, Senator, I'm not sure that I can answer that question. Like any legislation that's enacted by Parliament, the government and Parliament can decide to make changes to that legislation down the track, irrespective of whether or not there's a review or not. All I can say is, I think, go back to my earlier comments. This is an ongoing measure. Yes, there will be a review. I don't want to preempt the outcomes of any review, but as part of a normal process, if there were considered to be changes, issues around transitional arrangements are normally one factor that's considered.
And so is this particular review, in your experience, any different from any other sort of review that's in legislation?
Well, the government's announced that it will undertake a review. That's reflected in the explanatory memorandum. But, you know, I think it's a pretty general practice that where new measures are implemented, there is some sort of review process, and that's certainly the case for this exemption.
Okay, thank you. There's been a lot of discussion in this session and questions for you, and as well as evidence over the 2 hearing days around what the likely uptake of the of the legislation might be in terms of improving uptake of EVs, which are currently around 2% of new car sales. Your evidence today is that you can't necessarily isolate the impact of this measure from some of the other policy measures around import tariffs, the National Vehicle Strategy, fleet policies, and so on. Can you give us a general trajectory, or is there any sort of level of analysis that you can share with us about how the suite of policies that you've referenced is expected to impact the uptake of EVs?
I think there's a range of levers that will be open to government, and they're still in the process of consulting on those. And as I think it was already tabled, Minister Bowen's statements on Friday, that they're consulting. So I think, given the range, the work underway, consultation underway, a range of measures by both the Commonwealth and the states, it is a bit too difficult to say. Because it's not just this in isolation, it's the ongoing work as well.
You can't say whether the package of policies would be expected to improve EV uptake at all.
No, I can say that at a general level, yes, but just actually giving a definitive figure at this stage without knowing what the National Electric Vehicle Strategy, where it will land, I can't say that, but definitely we're coming, as you said, off 2% of EV sales. So you'd expect measures like this and others and the states are doing will have an impact.
Okay, I've got a couple of questions for DISA and then I'll come back to you, Senator Smith, with remaining time. Thank you for your submission to DISA. Thank you. You've put in your submission that Australia is a major producer of the raw materials required for batteries. Are you able to tell us about how having an Australian-made battery market would help us reduce the cost barriers to electric vehicles over time?
So I think we know that batteries are central to the transformation of the global energy system, and obviously we know that batteries are a significant component of the cost of electric vehicles. But I think until we finalise the strategy, it's a little bit hard for us to narrow down on a specific figure for what the impact might be on the price of vehicles in Australia.
Okay. What's the broad scope that we have to actually process the rare minerals that we have here in Australia and make batteries here?
Hi, Nicholas Clayton here, Manager of the Battery Minerals team of the Critical Minerals Office. So Australia has a fantastic resource endowment for our critical minerals. We're a top 10 reserve holder for basically every battery mineral that goes into your lithium-ion battery. And the industry also appreciates that we have the technical know-how associated with critical minerals processing. So we have 3 lithium hydroxide facilities which are in development. One has been commissioned in Western Australia. This lithium hydroxide goes directly into your cathode active material in a battery. So having that domestic capacity will be able to, I suppose, spur investment in Australia in a potential battery supply chain because we have that technical ability to do so. The exact kind of cost associated with doing that, we haven't undertaken such modelling, but we know that the industry appreciates the stability of Australia in terms of that investment environment and that technical and resource capacity.
How far off would we be from being able to manufacture batteries here?
So if we have the technical know-how and we are working to develop the precursor materials needed to support battery manufacturing. So we have a pilot cathode active material plant under development in Western Australia through the FBI CRC, the Future Battery Industries CRC. That is a prime example of where I suppose government through the CRC mechanism and industry is collaborating to build technical capacity in kind of building essential battery materials. There are a lot of other components that go into a battery in terms of kind of cell componentry and the like, and I'll probably defer to my colleague William Tan here to talk on that matter.
I think, as my colleague, of course, has said, I think at the moment, really our areas of specialisation are in the end around critical minerals. So Australia obviously does have considerable expertise in research and development, and we continue to innovate across clean energy products. So I think our focus is on innovation and technological improvements, which over time we would expect would help us to move further up the value chain.
Okay, thank you very much. I understand Senator Smith has some further questions. Senator Smith, you have Paul.
I do. Thank you very much, Chair. I have some questions for the Department of Industry, Science and Resources. Can the department share with the committee the consultation process that it went through in supporting the development of this initiative, this specific initiative?
Donna Looney here, Head of Division, Industry Growth Division. Our department hasn't been directly involved in the development of this strategy or this legislation.
Does that mean you have not been able to quantify, you also have not been able to quantify the positive impact or otherwise of this specific initiative on EV take-up in Australia?
No, Senator, we haven't looked at that. Our colleagues at Treasury would be leading that work.
Well, they've not been able to detail it either.
In terms of this particular piece of legislation, Senator, I might just mention that it was probably more likely the Department of Climate Change, Energy, Environment and Water that would have been involved than the Department of Industry.
So you expect that they were involved, or you know that they were involved?
I'd need to take that particular question on notice, Senator, but it would be more within their remit to be looking at that than within ours.
So what impact do you expect this policy will have on EV supply in Australia?
We are supportive of initiatives that will make EVs more accessible and affordable for Australians, and we would anticipate that that including this bill that will be one part, as our colleagues from Treasury have mentioned, of a broader strategy that will drive supply into the market.
But a $205 million initiative over 4 years, in your mind, should have a significant impact or not?
I haven't seen the modelling, Senator, so I'm not able to comment on that question.
So there is modelling?
I'm not. Sorry, let me rephrase my response to that. If there is modelling that has been undertaken on the question you've just asked, I haven't had visibility of it.
So, so the Department of Industry, Science and Resources does not have any modelling and has not been made aware of any modelling around this particular initiative and its impact on EV uptake in Australia?
That's correct, Senator.
Can I ask the same question of Treasury officials?
So, as we've noted earlier, Senator, this exemption is part of a broad suite of reforms. I think if any modelling was undertaken of the economic impacts of the policy, it would need to be undertaken on the package as a whole. But I'm not aware of any such modelling having occurred. But happy to take it on notice. If we can find out any further information.
So my question was related to modelling around this particular FBT concession, but could you also inquire whether or not there is any modelling done on the full suite of initiatives that you have previously cited as a reason for making it hard to understand what would be the positive impact of this particular initiative on EV uptake?
Yes, happy to take that on.
Thank you very much. Again, to the Department of Industry, Science and Resources, we've had a previous discussion in regards to supply chain or supply constraints in Australia. So my question is to the Department of Industry, do you expect these supply constraint issues to exist just over the short term, or do you expect them to be over the medium to longer term? And why?
Senator, I would defer to the previous answers by our colleagues in the Treasury, and that it's challenging to understand exactly how long it will take for the global market to adjust to current supply challenges. So I'm unable to give a definitive answer on that question.
But it doesn't sound like you would expect them to change in the short term. Some of the supply challenges that have been mentioned previously around availability of semiconductors and freight issues and those types of things are things that we're monitoring. However, I don't have a definitive answer about when those types of issues will be able to be resolved. Is it true that the Department of Industry, Science and Resources has access to the Office of the Chief Economist?
We have a division within our department that is called the Analysis and Insights Division, which is headed up by a person that we refer to in our department as the Chief Economist in our department.
Was the Chief Economist asked to review, inquire, analyse this particular initiative?
Not to my knowledge, Senator, but I can take that on notice if that's helpful.
In the normal range of activities of the Office of the Chief Economist, wouldn't this be a matter that would normally come across his or her desk for inquiry, reference?
So I would mention, Senator, that the Office of the Chief Economist within our department mainly focuses on the matters that are being looked at by our department. So given this is a Treasury piece of work, I wouldn't necessarily expect that it would have come to our Chief Economist for comment.
So is or isn't the uptake of EV vehicles in Australia a matter of importance to the Department of Industry, Science and Resources, or is it not?
It is, Senator, and we have some work that we're undertaking in the department, and you'll know about the National Reconstruction Fund that we have that will drive development in the sector. It has transport as one of its priorities, as well as clean energy component manufacturing, which is relevant to car manufacturing. And so as the market evolves, those opportunities will be able to be supported in Australia.
Okay. My final question, the Chair is asking me to wrap up. We've heard, so when we consider the full suite of measures to increase EV take-up in Australia, so the full suite of measures is a term that Treasury officials have used, what is the expected uptake of EV vehicles, or what is the goal for the uptake over the forward estimate period?
Senator, that's not something that our department has looked at, and I might note that there was the release of the electric vehicle strategy last week, and I'm sure that that work will be being undertaken through that.
It's a $205 million initiative. So, before I comment, Treasury officials, your response to or answer to that question?
Sorry, can you just repeat the question again, please, Senator?
Sorry, I missed that. Would you like me to repeat the question?
Yes,
Oh,
yes, please.
My apologies. So when we think about the full suite of measures being taken to increase EV uptake in Australia, full suite of measures being a term that Treasury officials used in the last little while, what is the number of vehicles to be taken up, or what is the goal of the number of vehicles to be taken up?
As I said, given the government's policies still being developed, I don't have an answer for you, Senator. And that's not the government in terms of their ultimate goal, just a matter of a consultation.
So my apologies again. You'll have to repeat that for me. Sorry, Chair.
We did miss the last couple of sentences there.
Sorry, I was just saying that ultimately the suite of policies is still a matter for consultation, including through the National Electric Vehicle Strategy. So the government targets for the government are a matter for government, and they've got their broader climate change decarbonisation objectives as well, and this will form part of that. But I don't have an answer for you in terms of uptake.
Finally, Chair, just one last point. I'm new to the Economics Committee, and I was surprised to see that the Treasury hadn't made a submission to the committee on this particular bill. Is that common course?
In relation to tax legislation, it does vary, but the general practice is that Treasury wouldn't make a submission, but we do make ourselves available to attend hearings like this.
So general practice, so meaning that if you were specifically asked by the committee to make a submission, you would make a submission?
Well, we would certainly take that on advisement, but as a general practice, we don't provide submissions. It's Treasury legislation. The focus is on developing the legislation, not providing supporting submission. A lot of the explanatory material on the legislation is actually included in the explanatory memorandum, and they're the sort of the primary products that Treasury produces. But as I said, we do make ourselves available to attend inquiry hearings.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Senator Smith, and thank you to all the officials who've made yourselves available today. Thank you for appearing as witnesses. That concludes today's hearing. Thank you to all the witnesses who appeared during our hearings, and to Hansard and to Broadcasting for their assistance. The committee reminds witnesses that it has agreed that responses to questions or notice should be provided to Secretariat by COB next Wednesday, the 31st of August. The committee stands adjourned.